first posted about this, but for some people, they thought short docs was referring to short documentaries.
Aha.
So it was like, oh, okay, cool. It makes sense. It's just
yeah, absolutely. It's a bit of a bummer to tune in and find that talk about synopses, and you're thinking about
well, yes and no. Like I was actually thinking there's like a correlation with doing like little short documentaries as a way of building a documentary.
Yeah,
as
true,
a whole thing. Okay, cool. We are live on YouTube. Copy the link tree should be okay, and then if I hit this enable leap link, cool. We don't actually need it to run for 24 hours, but sure, we'll just have to remember to disable it. So we should be live, and if people, you can test it. Back to meeting. Hi everyone that's tuning in to us on YouTube.
Yeah, hi.
Hide that. Gosh, it won't. Oh, because I'm screen sharing. I can't bring up the chat, can I?
Which, the YouTube chat or the Zoom chat?
Either.
I've got both open so I can have a look at them. I can watch them.
Okay, cool. Is that coming?
Hello world. Through? We are due to start very shortly.
Did those links come through? So it should just be that link tree.
On which Zoom? Oh, where?
I don't know. I was asking. I can't, because I'm sharing the PowerPoint. I can't see the chat anymore. I can see the video, but I can't see the
nothing
chat.
has come through on Zoom or YouTube chat.
Well, YouTube chat doesn't need the link. Well, the link tree works. So it's just that link tree thing that I've been emailing everyone.
Crab Edmund says he's coming through clearly on YouTube. Excellent.
Okay, cool. Do you want me to just post it on Twitter and Facebook, and you can kind of be, I don't know, do a jig? I mean, we've got the slide and everyone's like, cool, I know the...
Hello, everyone watching. Thank you for joining us. We will officially start in about 30 seconds. That it takes the wonderful Stu, who's much quicker on all things technological.
Well, I've set it up so there's just one link that I have to change. So if everyone just bookmark that link tree.
But that's relying on other people, Stu. So I'm just going to turn the light on.
All right. It's on Twitter. It's about to be on Facebook.
All right, guys, we're about to go live. So just you two need to be very quiet now. Okay. Okay. All right. Bye. Oh, 5 years old and already with a ton of attitude.
Yeah.
I wonder where they get that from. It's not Anna. That is for sure. Man.
We're ready to officially start?
Touch ID, yes. I'll give you my touch. Oh, no, I don't want to log in with my personal account. Thank you very much to our patrons. Man, too many. Oh, hey, cool. We've got people tuning in. That's cool. This is there, as you say, there has to be a better way to do this, but you know,
we've yet to find it.
We've now got one universal link that will work.
That is,
but it's sending like a bazillion. It's just sending a bazillion. We're live now posts.
We should make use of our delightful interns.
If they were up. Yeah. Oh, wait, why do I want to do that post type? I should.
All right, just before we officially start, I can see a couple of our patrons have joined us on the Zoom meeting, and welcome. What we would like you to do, if possible, is ask questions in the Zoom chat, and so that we can call on them at the appropriate times, and we'll ask you to, unmute yourselves and ask those questions out loud and join in the conversation. But just so that we can control when the questions come. That would be awesome.
Follow the link. Yes.
But also, Patreons, just so that you're aware, your video, it's up to you whether you want your video being broadcast live on YouTube or not. But just warning you that that will be happening.
Cool.
Okay, are we ready to start, Stu?
Yeah, I kind of, after all that, I just feel like a beer already. I might sneak off while we actually do the actual get into the bulk of it, but we're good. I'm going to close a bunch of things. Do you want me to stop? No. Okay, cool. I'll stop sharing to announce that we're officially kind of on. And yeah, let's.
Okay, ready?
Yeah. Yes. 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 Okay. GarageBand. The last button I had to hit is now underway.
Thank you for reminding me, because I had not pushed that button either.
Which
Okay.
should imply to the audiences that it's kind of tuning in that we're actually are recording this hopefully in slightly better quality from the live streams that will also come out in the podcast and be on YouTube in a cleaned up version, because hopefully this becomes like a bit of a good ongoing reference point, if that makes sense. Anyway, now we can start.
Hi.
Ching. Okay.
Hi, I'm Chas Fisher.
And I'm Stu Willis.
And welcome to Draft Zero, a podcast where two Aussie filmmakers try to work out what makes great screenplays work.
And this week, we're not a podcast at the moment, and B, we're not just two Aussie screenwriters, because we're also joined by screenwriter, developer, all-round guru,
Novelist,
biographer. We can go on and on about Stephen Cleary, and we have many times. Welcome to the show, Stephen.
Thank you. It's great to be here, all the way from France.
Now, Stephen will not be joining us in the usual drunken debauchery because it's 9 o'clock where he is. Well, not, as Stu pointed out the other day, it is France, so maybe you could be.
Breakfast wine.
But we're not a podcast today, and we're also not talking about screenplays, because we are talking about short documents. And it was Stephen, way back when Stu and I were at film school, who introduced us to a whole lot of short documents as development documents. And what we're going to try and tackle today in roughly an hour and a half is we're going to do half an hour of Stephen talking to us through the documents that in his experience have been useful, but then we're going to divide them up, and this is going to be hugely useful for me personally, in between the short documents that are useful in the development of story, that help writers write better screenplays or stories, whatever your medium, and then separately the short documents that help writers sell those stories and how those are different. And I personally really need this because Australia, we've just been through, 3 or 4 major funding rounds, and it feels like there's a whole lot more coming, where those short documents are just the vast majority of the work that you do in applying for that money.
It feels like to me, particularly with like early projects, that I've probably written more short documents than I have finished screenplays at this point. Partly because it's like testing an idea, but also partly because if you're going in for early development, you are handing in short documents. People want pitches, like a pitch is a form of a short document. And so when we're talking about selling documents, we're talking about selling in a broad sense, right? There's obviously selling to distributors, selling to financiers, but they're selling to funding bodies. They're selling the idea to producers. When you go in and have a meeting and give them something in an email, a log line is a short document, right? And when you're pitching someone that idea, you are using it in a selling mechanism. And I think the danger, and maybe we'll get into hopefully we'll get into those dangers with Stephen, is that when there's a problem when you conflate the two of them, because their purposes are different. And I think for a lot of us, part of the reason I apply for funding is it forces projects forward. It forces us to do the work, but maybe that there's a danger in using the process of applying funding to do the work and then saying that's the only document. Well, we've got a one page of synopsis now, and not sitting there and analyzing it forensically. So I think when as we outlined in that kind of bigger pitch from Stephen, this will be in 2 halves. This hopefully about an hour and a half live episode. The first half will be looking at the different types of short documents and their purposes, strengths and weaknesses. But then in the second half, we're going to go a little bit more into detail about the forensic documents, forensic story documents, treatments, and kind of step outlines, and we can go into what that means for Stephen. And, you know, for a lot of us, I think the reason that we're doing this is because step document, because treatments in particular are very common. But no one, when I was at film school, no one actually spent probably more than half an hour talking about treatments, yet they're in some way such a crucial part of what we do. And you and I know that we've written treatments and like, I have no idea if that's good or not, because it's really hard to find good examples, right? Like you can go and find award-winning screenplays online, but no one is putting out award-winning treatments. Show Bibles are the closest, right? Like seeing show Bibles of shows that have been made.
And even Stu, you and I, when we talk about treatments, we found out in the first time that we're actively collaborating as writers that you and I had 2 very different ideas of what a treatment was. And it turned out that you were working more from the sales idea of a treatment as a sales document, and I was working much more as a developmental document. But I guess before we bury the lead, maybe we should handball to Stephen for his view on short documents.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a great deal of confusion about short documents and you constantly get different perspectives on the documents, because the major confusion or the major collision is between the requirements of people who want short documents for reviewing a project for whatever purpose, whether it's a producer working out whether they want to be interested in the project, or it's a distributor, or it's an agency who are looking to find ways of giving money to projects. And a lot of the times in that situation, short documents are kind of used as a mechanism, certainly for agencies, as a mechanism of simply, you know, what's the quickest way that we can kind of codify the application process in order for us to get through the applications. So if you think about the purpose of the short document from the perspective of the agency, for example, or indeed the perspective of a producer, if you're getting, you know, 20 different projects sent to you a month or something, the purpose of the short document is to codify the process so that you can make a decision. That's not the basis of the decision. Is not what's the best way to present the story, what's the best way for me to even read the story. It's actually about what's the quickest and simplest way of me essentially being able to turn down a lot of stories. And that's really what, you know, it's used for. And it's surprising how often, and difficult how often for writers, how often if you actually ask a direct question, what do you mean by an outline? You know, what do you mean by a treatment? Firstly, people are usually not comfortable answering that question. They just go, you know, they're going to go, well, you know, a treatment. And if you say something like how many pages, they will rarely say, oh, well, you know, broadly speaking, between 8 and 12. You know, they'll be very vague about the specifics of the thing, because they haven't thought about it that way. It's a kind of shorthand use. So all the confusion comes, or a lot of confusion comes between these 2 processes. One is a reviewing process, and one is a creative process. And it's not often that people have thought carefully. People, you know, if you ask a distributor, what do you mean by an outline? You know, they haven't necessarily thought through that carefully. They know what they want when they get it, but until they get it, they won't go, oh, that's right. So your job is to kind of predict what they're after. And it's difficult. Quite a lot of the time I say to people, you know, if someone asks you for a treatment, you know, ask them, how long should it be? Broadly speaking, if you can, you know, do you like a treatment more than 10 pages? You know, if they say no, as most people will, then, you know, don't give them a 20-page treatment. But there are no rules. That's where the confusion comes. There aren't conventions in the way that there are with a screenplay. You know, if you deliver a 250-page screenplay, you're probably going to get a lot of people going, you know, well, it doesn't look great from the start off. You know, if it's got pages and pages of scene description, a big print, that people are going to go, that's problematic. You know, there's all sorts of accepted conventions in screenplays, but in short documents there aren't. And so you have to kind of navigate your way through, and that can be, you know, confusing and difficult.
Now, just to I mean, you've mentioned the word agencies. And so I think it'd be fair to say that the three of us, for the most part, live in the world of government funding. And that's not just Australia, UK, that's like most of Europe, and frankly, almost everywhere else in the world outside of maybe like India, South Korea, and the US. And they often in those applications are quite codified in the length of documents you are to provide. I mean, Stu and I, we could spend an hour and a half just bitching about the recent vagaries of the Australian document application requirements. But I just wanted to say that if we've got listeners from a more, I guess, market-driven market, like the US, this is still going to be, I feel, relevant because of the documents that you might be using to sell. You know, a log line in particular is going to be hugely important and different depending whether you're trying to break your own story or pitch it to someone else. A one-page synopsis is also going to be very different. And I've, you know, had recent contracts with producers in LA that did have as a step a treatment. And to your point, Stephen, I did very carefully explore outside of the contract, but what were their expectations of the treatment in terms of length and what it was supposed to do for them.
I'm gonna, it's kind of semantic, so I don't want to dwell on it too long. I slightly disagree with that idea that there is a clear separation between the US and the European system. We do have funding agencies, but pitching, which is fundamentally what we're talking about, and in the world of independent filmmaking, which I would say is the vast majority, like outside of the studio system, like the American, whether it's the American Film Market or the EFM or 37 South, of which sadly is not happening this year, you know, they're all going to have these kinds of documents, right?
Yeah, but they're not gonna ask for a step outline and your, like, I mean, the recent applications that we've had to do had 5 different documents all asking the same 5 different questions there.
But I mean, I would say that those kind of documents, like what are your development notes, etc., can be more informal. In my experience of working in the like my touching on the US system, you're not going to sit there and submit a 5-page development notes. But I have had, like, actually, no, coming back to it, like we've had to do kind of like development notes with Aurora. Like we will sit in there. This is what we're planning to do. Everyone signs off, and then we do it. Right.
Which just makes sense from protecting you and what your expectations are and that you're delivering on it. And
it would have been great to talk to Catherine about it, like Catherine McMullen, but that whole American pitching thing where you go in and pitch for 40 minutes, it sounds like that is ultimately just delivering a verbal treatment, right? And you probably write it out as a treatment. So I do think this is, I guess this is us indirectly agreeing, which occasionally happens, Chas, where it's like, this is going to be useful to everyone. And there's going to be some specifics for those in the American system that they're going to be like, wow, you can get government money? That's crazy. Mate, it's like, for anyone that asks, it's like doing a honor and having got honors degree. I got 2 honors degrees and a master's. So I've done a lot of long documents in my lifetime, which is possibly, I ended up in screenwriting. But that idea of, shit, I am writing like 10, 15,000 words. It's like handing in a 15,000 word assignment, right? Group assignment, potentially, where, you know, there's one person that does all the work. No offense, Matt, but that's I don't do all the work. And then, but only 4 people in the class of like 100 are going to pass. That's what it feels like, right? So it's a way of getting some feedback on this, but also, you know, that's kind of the, in a way, the end point, because let's start with different types of short documents and how they could be used in a positive sense. Because I do find that as much as I bitch, these applications have forced me to develop story ideas and do so in a forensic way. And I'm working on a musical project at the moment. I know, way on brand. Let's get the guy that does hard genre and is into like heavy music to write a music based on pop songs. But we started off with like a 1 paragraph, and then we turned it into a synopsis, and it's building into a Bible. And I'm actually putting them through the process. I'm using short documents as a way of working with effectively a client, the producers of this project, of how to develop the story. So I think it's making me, having an understanding of this will also help me be a better writer in that kind of relationship where someone else comes to me with an idea and I kind of need to steer them through it. So I'm going to switch to your PowerPoint slides, Stephen, just for the moment. Like you're not you're comprehensive, but not, there's a particular term, not exhaustive. Does that make sense? Is that the right terminology?
That works.
Cool. So let's bring that up.
I mean, the thing to say, I think, about a couple of things to say about this notion of confusion of function or of short documents is that that tension between the creative use of the document for the writer and the use of the documents as selling documents. That tension also exists within the writer, because in a way, for the writer, the short document is also a way of selling the story to yourself. You know, because if you're starting off with the story, or an idea for a story, and you start to work it through short documents, what you're doing is you're kind of working through how good the idea is, if it's sustainable through any kind of period, if when you take it through one form of short document or another, then the document will open up possibilities in the story for you. If you're asking the form of the short document, each short document has its own form, and each of those forms has a strength and a value which is distinct from the strength and value of another short document. One way of thinking about it that I'm fond of is if you put all your short documents in a room together, it's kind of like a gym. You know, each of these documents is kind of like a machine that makes your story stronger. But in the same way that if you go to a gym, you know, if you go on one machine, it makes your legs stronger, another machine makes your arms stronger, and, you know, whatever, your abs stronger. The short documents work in the same way. If you go through one kind of short document, it'll make one aspect of your story better. It'll force you to think about one aspect of your story. If you do a synopsis, for example, it is forcing you to look at the plotting of your story more than anything else. If your plotting doesn't work, or if it isn't properly worked out, then when you come to do a synopsis, that problem that you have, that weakness in plotting, will be made apparent by the form itself. And then from that, you'll then have to, you will then get on to using the synopsis to make your plotting better. Revising and revising a synopsis will make your plotting more and more muscular. But the problem with that is, just like if you go to a gym and use one machine that makes your right leg really good, then you end up with one really huge right leg, but your stomach and your shoulders are really puny. So when someone
looking like Roger Federer.
Someone looks at the project, they go, okay, well, this aspect is really strong, but everything else is slightly weak. So it's the balancing off of that's why short documents, as a group of documents that you work on, rather than constantly doing one kind of short document, is probably a good idea, because it gives you more of an all-round strength and capability. Once you know what those machines can do, which is what I think is really important about short documents for writers, is to get familiar with all kinds of different short documents, because you will then start to understand this document does this well, this document does this well. Once you've got that familiarity with the range of documents that you have and what their values and their weaknesses are, then at a certain point in the development of your story, you then say, well, I need to do this or I need to do that, at this point. And when you've got your project in front of you, say, okay, what do I need to be paying attention to now? Is it character? Is it plot? Is it theme, or whatever area it is? And then you go to the document you need to use. So
one of the things that
you need a range of documents.
Yeah. One of the points where I hope we'll get to here, Stephen, is you might elaborate on where you felt in your experience, particularly as a developer who's assisting other writers, supporting other writers in developing their stories, is when is short documents not, like, when should you move to pages? Like, when is actually writing the screenplay the appropriate document to solve the problem that the writer is dealing with? Yeah. But maybe I'm jumping the gun somewhat, and we should we summarize briefly the list of short documents you've got for us?
I just want to, I'm just going to, it's more of a philosophical question, but actually, no, I'm going to go to the document because it made me think of that list, right? Is that you've got, hang on, is that up now? Yes.
Yeah.
So script is in here. Oh, nope. This happened last time, didn't it? Where I got to click annotate first and then pick the tool. And then I'm like, script. Yes, cool. So the script, in a way, is a form of a short document. It's a representational idea of what the film is going to be, right?
Yeah.
As there's this great quote that was going around from Twin Peaks guys. I just went David Lynch. where he's like, oh, writing, I was never much of a writer, you know, I'm not really great with words or spelling or grammar. You know, for me, writing is just a way of recording my ideas. And he's obviously a writer and director, but in some ways that's true. It is the aspiration for the film. So a script is a selling document as well. And I want to put that in the context because for Chas and I, we've talked about this on the podcast, the difference between a shooting script as a functional template for how you make the movie and then the selling version of it and how that can slightly change your approaches in writing. And I'm actually in that process at the moment with doing a shooting script, which is a little bit more annotated. So I think the point I'm trying to make about that observation is that don't see them as bad things, that learning to be good at these things is as good a skill as a writer as learning how to be good at writing a script. And that perhaps, as you say, it's a story gym, but it's also learn how to be really good at that thing.
Yeah.
You know, because that's as important as being really good at the script thing.
The other thing to think about as well is, of course, that for the writer, sorry, to what you're doing with all of these documents are a photograph of a story at a certain moment in time. And that's really, you know, the fundamental thing you need to be aware of. Each of these documents freezes your story in time at that moment. And that's one of the things it's useful for, because it tells you where you are. And quite often the demands of the document force you to make certain realizations about the story that you may not keep consciously in your mind. You know, you might look at this document and read it back and go, I haven't really thought of that. I haven't seen it that way. Some of these documents are also not written. And I think short documents for me is a much broader series, a much broader concept than for a lot of people. That I would say things that you film, for example. Increasingly with technology, you know, the fact that people have phones and can film on their phones, which they couldn't do 10 years ago or 15 years ago, anywhere near as much. The fact that you can actually, you know, effectively shoot and edit, it doesn't matter how roughly. I'm not interested in the technical quality. It's not something you're going to be showing in the cinema or on TV. But the fact that you have these tools available to you as a writer, for me, is something that you can't forget. You need to be thinking about, are there points at which this is useful? There are certain kinds of story, for example, which are, the best example I've got is a film I worked on a while ago, which is a time travel comedy where a character duplicates himself. You know, it was made in South Australia.
Oh, Infinite Man.
Yeah.
Infinite Man. The problem with the Infinite Man as a screenplay or a treatment is that you have a character, his name was Dean, who replicates himself and then replicates himself again, and then starts meeting himself in different moments. So when you read a script, you have literally a block of dialogue which says Dean 1, and then Dean 2, and then Dean 3. And then it goes on the scene description says Dean 1 leaves the room, Dean 2 sits on the bed, Dean 3 goes into the kitchen. And when you're reading that, there's an endless repetition of the word Dean, and there's endless dialogues with Dean 1, Dean 2, Dean 3. And you get lost very quickly. You're simply lost in this written description of something that doesn't really work off the page. So when you're reading it, you're thinking, okay, is this story working? Does it work? Similarly on the treatment was almost incomprehensible because it's, you know, it's kind of like, it reads like a cryptic puzzle. What they then did is in order to find out if the story worked, they then took the story and they went, not on location, but they went to a location which was similar enough to the story to work for the location. And they filmed it very, very crudely, not with actors, but with the producer, director, and holding the script in front of them. So they weren't reciting the lines. They were literally reading off the script, but shot it in such a way, the director was there, and the director could have positioned the performers, as it were, in the different positions they would, and then cut it. And then particular scenes, when you cut them together that way, even though they were non-professional performers, it was not lit, it was the most rudimentary kind of, this is what I mean by an animatic. It kind of, the analog is a kind of like an animation. It's a kind of line drawing of your story. That when that was done, that process, which was a development process, made it quite clear immediately which scenes worked well and which scenes didn't, in a way that we could not possibly have understood from reading it off the page.
Yep.
And for that particular story, with that kind of duplication, the complexity of the story was greater than the capacity of the treatment to represent that story. So at that point in the development process, you run up against the limitations of the document you're using. Now, if you can, you need to have the kind of imaginative capacity. It wasn't my idea, it was the idea of the producer. You have to have the imaginative capacity to say, okay, what's another way of doing this? If this doesn't seem to be solving the problem creatively, how do we find, what kind of document can we use to do it? And they came up with that kind of idea. Another thing, another short document I would consider a short document would be, for example, a quick reading. I say this to writers all the time, you know, that whenever you can in the process of writing, if you can have a reading early on, you know, it shows you problems in the story and the characters that you don't get when you read off the page. And it doesn't really, and the other thing about it is the great thing about a reading for a writer is if you sit back and allow the reading to happen rather than direct the reading, you're forced to listen to your work coming back to you, which puts you in a reflective rather than, as it were, a proactive position. One of the things in writing, you know, through development is that the writer is kind of always proactively trying to push things forward. And sometimes the process is simply sitting back and allowing the story to come to you through the performance of people. And it doesn't often matter whether those people are good performers. That's not the point. Just simply sitting in relation to your story in a different way and being forced to do that by the nature of the process of this short document, which I would call a script reading, a kind of short document. It doesn't have to be written to be a document in my mind. Then it takes you to a different place and it changes the process for you and will allow you to see your story in a different way, and new ideas and new things will come to you. So all of these documents on the list here are documents that you can use. Some of these documents are much more common in the traditional development process and the traditional evolution of a story. But if you're writing, I would say, you know, be really open to a change of process. I'm kind of a bit of a radical with this. I'm also, you know, in the same way that I would say to people that you need to have a much more complex and varied idea of short documents, I would also say to people you need to think about process in relation to writing as much as you do about the creative ideas. If your story isn't working for you, what happens if you write it in a different room? It's one of the questions I ask people. You know,
just for the benefit of our future podcast listeners, can I just read through this list quickly? So the list of documents that we're looking at is a 1-paragraph synopsis, a 1-page synopsis, a 3-page outline, treatment, script, written scenes, filmed scenes, teaser trailer, improvisation by writer and actor, filming actors on scenes, in scenes on location, readings of scenes, filmed animatic of script drafts, storyboards, illustrations, PowerPoint presentations, performances of scenes in front of live audiences. And it feels like these, you know, from a traditional writing perspective, most writers would only engage in the written documents that they can do by themselves in terms of development, rather than these other documents that would require the input of other people and, you know, almost like events and meetings and performances. But also it feels like this list is a bit light on up front in terms of the other documents that we might get to that are just written documents that writers can use in story development. Like,
but just to touch on Stephen's comment about the doing a script read without actors, I think there's different value between using actors and non-actors, right? There's it's in my mind this week. Hollywood Camera Work is this like series of breaking down different camera directing styles and coverage, right? And they've done the whole thing in 3D. I'm just going to stop sharing for the moment. They've done the whole thing in 3D, and then basically the idea is that the digital puppets, the actors have no performance. They literally move. There's no walk cycles or anything. And their argument is because they want to show how camera work can be used to create emotion separate from the performance, right? And it works. You see there and cut these scenes together with like just a very monotone reading of the script and a dolly in can create an emotional feeling or a pull out that is completely, I mean, it's obviously there's a degree of coloring in the voice, but they're trying to get rid of that as much as possible. So having someone read the script aloud can be a way of hearing a story, as you say, seeing it through a different lens or being in a different room. Apparently, Peter Weir, when he's developing a film, or used to, he's basically retired now, he would read the whole script to cassette tape and then put the cassette tape in his car and then just listen to him reading the script on loop while he was in pre-production. So whenever he hopped in the car, he was hearing that, because he was just wanted to like seep in to it. So I think there is stuff in there that, as Stephen says, that you can think of, that there's ways that you could do this without needing a whole crew or having more technical skills, or not. Like, you haven't got it in here, but like a film dynamic, like mood boards can be a way of developing a story, right? I've often, in the case of like ads, but I get my students in motion design to do what I call textmatics, right? So textmatic is when you're blocking out an ad and you literally have placeholder text, this shot, wide shot here of this. And then occasionally I've seen people do that with dialogue as well. I think they did it on Lord of the Rings, where they would get actors to read lines of dialogue and cut them in, but without even storyboards. Literally just kind of using it as ways to kind of learn the story. So I think there's things that you could probably do in here yourself. There's nothing to stop a writer reading out their own script aloud and reading it as a recording.
I think, remember that, people, the reason that people write, a 3-page synopsis, a treatment, are they told to do this because that's the process by which this industry works. Okay, that's that's mainly the reason people write treatments. People don't write treatments because they have an overwhelming urge to write a 50-page prose outline of their story. They're doing it because people are telling them to do them, because there is a place for these documents in the industry and in the funding process. That's not the same thing as saying, what's the best way of arriving creatively for myself at the story that I'm trying to tell. And particularly in the early stages of a story, for a writer, find what you like doing, find what makes you, fire off, find what sparks you up, and play with those things and play with those ways of thinking about a story. One of the very best ways of developing a story in my mind is telling it. We talk about pitching as a kind of process of selling a story to someone who's funding. The absolutely wonderful thing about telling a story to someone that you have in your mind is they can't lie. If you look at someone's eyes, don't forget whether they tell you it's wonderful afterwards. Just watch them as you tell the story, and you can see them drift away. You can see you can see when you've got them, because you can tell by their face. And then when they start to pretend to look interested, but they're actually starting to get bored, you can see that too. So you can, and if you've got to sit someone down and say, can I just for 5 minutes tell you a story that I got in my mind? And you start telling them, as soon as that period of, that part of the story arrives where you haven't worked out the story properly, it's not clear in the way that you're telling it, you can immediately see it in the face of the person who's doing it. There's really no faster way of working out where your plot doesn't work than telling a story to someone. It only takes you 5 minutes to tell it, and it's there straight away. Now, other documents will do the same thing. A synopsis will bring out that fault as well. When you struggle at a certain point in a synopsis to write that paragraph, that's because your plot doesn't work. The reason you can't phrase this easily, the reason you're going, oh, how do I say that? Maybe I say it this way, maybe I say it that way, is because there isn't a clear way of saying it, because it isn't clear. Not because suddenly you've lost the capacity to write descriptive prose. That's why a synopsis is really good, because it brings out the problem. But a synopsis takes you, a day and a half to write. It takes you 5 minutes to sit your mum down and say, can I tell you something? Or to sit a friend down and do the same thing. So, play with all of these documents and know that each of them will do a different thing, and each of them will also play, some of them will play to a particular strength that you have. So as you play with these documents and explore them, you'll find the things you do really well. And people will say to you, because when you show them to people, people start saying, that's really good, that's really interesting. You'll have found a strength of yours. It doesn't mean to say you then, overwhelmingly use that kind of short document. The other thing I would always say to people, short documents, is the short documents that you struggle the most with are probably the short documents you probably need to do the most work on, because they are the reason you struggle with a short document. People say, I hate writing treatments. A lot of writers say, I hate writing treatments. Why broadly do writers dislike writing treatments? Because they downplay character. That's the truth. Most treatments wash character away and tend to foreground action and plot. So those writers that love writing action and plot will have a better time with the treatment.
No,
You know, they'll kind of go, yeah, I kind of know I do. It's still difficult, but they want those writers that find themselves think with characters, describe themselves as really essentially writers of character, hate treatments because the treatment is not interested as much in character as it is in plot. That's the nature of the form of the treatment.
Yeah. I would
You know?
venture that, like, I usually write very plot driven stuff, but I hate treatments as well. But it's interesting just to reflect on my process that I write a lot of short documents that clarify my plot before I go to script pages. And my early drafts, the thing I find myself working the most on from draft to draft is actually the character stuff, because that is the thing that I've most neglected, I guess, just from listening to you in the lead up in the developmental process, because I know what these characters do and I know why they do it, but I don't necessarily know who they are or how they feel about these things, or how other characters around them might react to this. Anyway.
Well, I mean, we can be open about the project that we're working on together, that we're writing together, and I think we have this moment where you're like, oh, it's going to be long, and you know, the first act is a really long first act, and for me, just in terms of my process, because I'm kind of shoehorning you a little bit more into how I work. You know, we've kind of done a very extensive scriptment. So, Stephen, for this project, we did index cards, which is not something you've got on your short docs thing, but we used index cards in kind of like a writer's room meeting together every week. Then we turned those index cards into a bit of like a 4-page synopsis. And then we went to scriptment, right? And I kind of drove the scriptment. I called it a scene breakdown. Chas was like, oh, this feels like a treatment with like scene headings. And it's somewhere in between. I like it as
pedantry.
A writer.
Draft zero pedantry.
Yeah, classic. I mean, for me, I just like it as a development document because it's like, it's a way of nutting out the story without having to write prose that someone else is going to read. It's because I know the document is only for writers. There's none of that pressure. It's just like, I don't know how to describe it. Like literally writing it, I don't know how to describe this properly, but this is the bad version of the idea, right? Yeah. But what we found is that we're spending a lot longer in the script on character work, right? I guess dialogue, writing stuff that's overly long. But for me, I'm okay with that because we've not done that work. And a script is the first opportunity to really put character voice in the process that we've adopted, the characters. And that's the exciting part, finding out how those characters talk, how they really kind of interact with each other in the minutia. And it's interesting that I'm not seeing, though you've talked about it in the past, I'm not actually seeing on this list of documents anything like character voice documents, you know, letters to the self or whatever it is that you maybe actors would use. Though it's interesting to me that there's a few of these short document techniques could be lifted from theater, you know, or dramaturgy. You know, improvised backstory is pretty common as a director to use that. Let's rehearse the scene before this scene, you know, just to see what, you know, so when you go into that scene, there's like a lot of given circumstances or it's on its feet. You know, so
that's what I think those kinds of documents, improvisatory stuff, and the talking with actors and the reading out loud and the shoot, all of that stuff is really about helping to explore character. And I don't use them too much because you know, things like, you know, the kind of short documents that you would use, like you know, write a letter from a character before the story starts. You know, pick a vital moment in the character's life before the story starts, and have them write a letter telling their friend about what happened to them, or these kinds of character exploration stories. That's kind of okay, but I think people can. My worry about those kind of documents, I don't use them too often because writers can, you know, they're too easy for writers to write. You know, for most writers, they're going to go, "Oh, that's lovely. I can do that." When I'm in development and writer says, "Yeah, I can do that," I'm usually like, okay, well, that's not a great idea.
You're just admitting you like to torture writers, Stephen.
I want to get them working on things they need to do. If the writer goes, "Oh yeah, I can do that," you know, they're completely relaxed. They've been there. They know the character. They go, "Yeah, I know that." I can immediately see how that will work. You know, which kind of means they're in their comfort zone. And in the story, what you're trying to do is get to those things that aren't really working that you can make better. And so, in some sense, you want to pull them out of the comfort zone to the area where they're not entirely comfortable with. So, but absolutely, those short documents are kind of useful. As I say, I'm slightly suspicious of using them too often in terms of character. But when you get to things like, you know, the synopsis, for example, the story I'm very keen on, document I'm very keen on we'll come to it later, is what I would call the story synopsis, as opposed to a plot synopsis. The story synopsis document is about plot, it's about theme. You know, it's about how do I bring to the surface the theme of the story.
Well, should we get into it now? Do you?
Let's move on. Like we could sit here talking about a whole bunch of different little documents that people can use, and hopefully we put some stuff in the comments. Actually, like this YouTube's going to link. I know there's short documents that are part of our little group. People have been like, "Oh, do this scene workshop, backstory stuff." So I'm going to share screen because we've got a lot to get through when we are somehow at halfway already, and yet on slide 3. So. I guess this idea here, if you're seeing the slide, which is that the aspect of story presentation, which other short documents feature individually, are presented collectively in the treatment. You've got this as this slide, and I'm assuming this is an overall idea of how to approach and structure working with short documents, correct?
You've got with short documents, the kind of king of short documents and the queen of short documents is the treatment. You know, it's, you know, and ultimately the script. So the point about all the different other short documents is they all, as it were, allow you to explore a different aspect of your story. All of those things have each of those different ways of doing it. Those different documents will bring one aspect of the story to the fore, to the front. And by doing that document, you are exploring that specific aspect of the story. Once you've got those done to your, you know, to your heart's content, then the treatment is where you bring it all together. And again, as I say, remembering that you're doing a treatment probably because you have to. You know, if you said to me in an ideal world, if you were going to you were given the money to make your story anyway, would you ever need to go to treatment? I don't know if I would ever do that. I would say your scene by scene is your ideal writing document.
Just as a personal preference, I've fallen into that being the one big document I write before I go to pages, but everyone's process is different. Well, so how it's started organically for me is I set out to write a 3-page synopsis, and it naturally kind of turns into a 10 to 15 page synopsis. So, and from there I just go to pages, and that document's similar to the scriptment that Stu was talking about before, except that how many pages is our scriptment, Stu? Is it like 40 pages?
30. That was well, we've also got like scratch dialogue in there. We kind of broke our own rules. I've been more disciplined in the past.
The reason I would take the treatment out in an ideal world, I think I would say, is that to get a treatment that really works for the reader, you're essentially writing in the way that you would write a good short story. You know, a treatment that works has a kind of literary style, and that's not of any interest to a screenwriter writing a screenplay.
Yeah.
Okay, you're spending the problem with a treatment, which you have to live with, is that in order to make it really readable, you have to spend an awful lot of time making it literary, and you are not working in a literary medium ultimately. So it's, in some senses, you know, a readable treatment for the outside world is a literary document that you have to knuckle down and write well. Ideally, you wouldn't waste the time doing that if you could go straight to script, you know, because you don't need literary skills to write a screenplay. It's a different kind of set of skills. So that's the problem with the treatment, is that you're kind of being pulled over into a literary area where if you could, you wouldn't have to go there.
And I have found this in your distinction between development tools, like the treatments I write for myself as development tools, I find very easy to write. But then when they are to be read by someone else as a sale document for the story, that's when I find them really difficult. And I'm investing, as you say, vast amounts of time making this document read well. And none of that time is going to make the script any better. It's just going to make the treatment better.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, you know, that's just one of the facts of life about an industry where the treatment is foreground. You know, if the treatment is foreground in the industry within which you work, you have to get skilled at writing treatments, and you know that a lot of the skill of writing treatments is not a transferable skill into writing screenplays. Some of it is, but some of it isn't. You know, so but that's just the way the world is. You've got to. It's another skill you have to learn in order to be good at, you know, storytelling and film and television making. And you know, there are lots of skills like getting on with people that are also necessary, you know, in order to function in that world. So it's not always about being able to write a screenplay or a script, teleplay. Okay, let's go back to that list a second.
Oh, you want to go back to the? Do you want to go back to the list?
Not the list. Sorry. If we go to the next after the treatments.
Yeah, it's about the premise.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've gone from this into the premise. So we're talking about the premise now.
Again, I'm a bit the premise we will talk about in kind of practical detail in a little while, but the premise is kind of, for me, is a summation of the story, and it's not it's really what the story is. It's to do with what the story is fundamentally about. So it's not, if you like, a logline, which we'll look at in a second, is more of it's a kind of breakdown of the story in a very compressed way, what happens and the character and whatever. The premise for me is somewhere between, it's on the interface between the internal impulse for the writer and the nature of the story. So I'm not, well, we'll see when I come later. I'm happy if a writer says to me, if the writer says, can I tell you what my premise is? And I go, yeah. And they take out a little tobacco tin, and inside the tobacco tin are 3 pebbles, a seagull's feather, and a bottle top. And they say, that's my premise, which is to say, it's the thing the writer looks at, that when they can see it in front of them, they kind of feel they know where they are.
Yeah.
You know, and those things might be the thing the writer picked up from the beach they were walking on the day that story arrived in their mind, where they suddenly thought, I got to tell this story, you know. And if the writer wants to lift that tin up and smell the sea in the tin, and that takes them back to that place they were mentally on the beach and brings them back into the emotional, you know, psychological space of the story, for me, if it works for the writer, it's fine. You know, it doesn't have to be written down, but of course, the premise in a writerly sense is, can you write something down that kind of nails the story for you in some way, but not about nails what happens and who's the protagonist and whatever, but in some sense nails the story in a kind of broader sense, which is approaching a kind of thematic place, the underlying purpose of the story itself, rather than just the events and the characters in the story.
I like that, because that tends to how I think of it. And I think there is a sales version of it, which you could call the hook or the elevator pitch, that I've got a project that I pitch as Tom Clancy's The Office. That's not the synopsis, right?
Yeah.
That's
like
the hook. And then there's another project which is like, there's a long, elaborate description of what it's about, because it's very thematically driven, right? Called Crimes in Southern Australia. Our 2-word pitch is crimes, actually, right? And they're a little bit flippant, because we're trying to make them like, even though that show's quite serious, but for me, they're about what is the thematic idea and how do I sell, not even the thematic idea, the conceptual idea to people, because not all projects are driven by plot, which is the limitation of the logline when we get to it, is that generally loglines are a very, they're prejudiced towards plot. They're biased towards plot-driven stories. And the problem, if you assume that the logline is the only way to sell ideas, then the only ideas you're going to sell are what are suitable in the logline.
I feel like, I mean, I don't want to bury the lead, but are any of these short documents not better for plot than for other elements like character or theme or what have you? Because the ones we've got listed here are the premise, the logline, the 1-page synopsis, the step outline / beat outline, the story synopsis, and the treatment. And nearly all of those documents at glance for me are ones that are really good at helping the writer develop the plot and the story spine of their story, but not the characters or themes.
For me, the story synopsis is a document that's primarily about theme. I would say that's the differentiating between the 1-page and the story synopsis. It's a particular kind of document. I'd say that's almost that's a
focus on that one for a second.
Okay, I was going to suggest that we just run through the whole thing.
Let's just run through them, because we'll see. If you, I think if we go through this, I'm using every now and then. I use Peter Weir's film Witness as a kind of example, because we need a kind of, you know. So for those of you who remember Witness, it's about a man called John Book, who's a cop, and there's a young boy called Samuel, and Samuel sees a murder in a toilet, in the gents' toilet at the railway station. And he's the only witness, and so the cop takes the kid to this, try and identify the kid, identifies the witness, the killers. One of the killers is a cop. The cop, John Book, has to go on the run with this Amish boy, I should have said that. And he goes into the land of the Amish, and he stays there and hides. He's shot on the way. He recovers, and gradually the killers close back in, and John Book has to deal with the killers who come to get revenge on the boy, to take him out. And at the same time, is the real story, or certainly a large part of the story, is the transformation effected on John Book by his time amongst the Amish. You know, so the surface of the story is a thriller, about a cop guarding a boy from people who want to kill him. The internal story of this of Witness is about the transformation of a hard-bitten loner by being enveloped by an entirely different community with entirely different values and morals that he's used to, a rural community for this city man. That's the story we're talking about. So there's lots of stuff to do with plot. It's a thriller. There's lots of plotting in that story, but there's also large internal movement of character. So it's the documents we're looking at are documents that we want to try and balance off in our short documents, those different forces that are working on the character in the story. That's why we're using Witness.
I mean, I like that verbal pitch in itself feels like an example of a really effective short doc. I mean, obviously the film's been made and you've talked about it incessantly, but I just like that you saying, and the internal story is, right? Because it's very clear as a sales document and it's selling the film to everyone that's listening right now, right? Is that it actually makes it very clear. We don't actually have to work very hard to know what that internal story is. We don't have to put on our little magnifying glasses and analyze it. It is literally spoon feeding us what that internal story is. And maybe that's a good thing to do with these short documents, is to understand that there's times where being obscure works against you. Trying to be too subtle, trying to be too clever actually can end up frustrating people, as opposed to helping you convince them that what your thing is doing is worth doing.
An old friend of mine, Simon Vanderbilt, has a saying which he repeats, which I learned from him, it's remarkable how often I use it when I'm talking to writers, which is beware of the fear of being understood. And the number of times I say that to a writer, which is, why can't you just say it plainly? Don't disguise it. It's, you're going to all these efforts to disguise this thing you want to say. Just say it. And in short documents, again, it's finding ways of saying the obvious things elegantly, rather than, that's really what the art of the short document, the written short document. It's about elegant writing. It's about knowing what you've got and then moving that into a kind of elegantly written thing. The problem is that writing prose is different from writing screenplays, the script. It's a different literary skill, and the problem for a lot of writers is they're good at writing scripts, but they may not be very good at writing a 2-page prose document. The only thing I'd say about that is you get better with practice, which is why I'm always fond of pushing writers to write the short documents they don't want to write. Because if they don't want to write them, they probably haven't written enough of them, and so making them write more will make them better at it, because you get a lot better with practice. It's not.
You sound like what I say to my kids almost every day is, how do we get better at something?
Yeah, exactly. And short document's absolutely right. If you're not good at a certain kind of short document, I would recommend that you spend a lot of your time writing more of them, the ones you don't like, because you will get better at it as long as you analyze and look for what you're not doing well and try and improve and show it to other people who can help you and help you through that process.
All right.
Anyway, so if we move on to the...
Did you want to go back through the log line, the 1-page synopsis, the step line?
No, because we'll come to that. We'll come to that as we go through, I think.
All right,
so
cool.
This list that we're looking at here is kind of the primary written documents. So we've moved away from... Now, okay, if you go to the next slide, if you're looking at... you will see the documents we talked about, the premise, the log line, the 1-page synopsis, the step outline in that list. And what I've got in here are the kind of in between things that you would do. So once you have your premise, your initial impulse of what the story is, you go away and you do a bunch of stuff, your research notes. It's really about exploring that idea, whichever way you want to explore it, and making notes for yourself, which are, notes about the time, the period the story was in, the geographical place, just the things you need to know about the world of the story that you're working in. So just to get yourself more familiar. And that's, again, another kind of the research you might do, and the notes you would make about the research is another kind of short document. And then you would move to a log line, because you would have a slightly more formed idea of the story by this point. So by now, if you get to the log line part, you should kind of know who the story is going to feature as the main character or characters, and you should broadly know, if you're going to be thinking about a log line, what the story is, the direction the story is going to go in. So you can start to formulate a first feel for the audience you're going at. Once you've got that, it's okay. Broadly speaking, it's this story. The next question you need to ask is what happens in detail. I want to move to a more a more detailed understanding of what happens in the story, I would always go to character next, because, and for a really simple reason, which is that the big problem with short documents, particularly treatments, is they read like a series of events happening one after another. You know, this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then that's this. And I'll say this somewhere else in the notes that I've got. That's the single biggest problem with the treatment, is it reads like one damn thing after another, and you lose a sense of the people in the story and the world. It's just like it becomes this kind of plotted list. The reason it does that is because I think very often writers at the beginning of the process lose touch with the notion that things happen in a story because of the people in the story. There are very few events in a story that just happen. You know, occasionally a meteorite comes crashing through the roof, or, you know, a burglar walks into your house and, you know, robs you or whatever in a story. But generally speaking, in a story, the vast majority of things happen in a story the way they happen because the people in the story would do those kinds of things. So the question, what happens in my story, is answered by the question, by the statement, well, it depends who's in your story. You know, the reason that happened the way they do is because those people are those people. So if you don't know who those people are properly, then the question of what happens in my story can't properly be answered. So if you find your treatment is becoming this happens and this happens and this happens and this happens, which is a kind of litany of plot events, what it means to me is that you're losing contact with the characters in the story.
So what are some quick examples, and you can just rattle them off, we don't have to debate their virtue. What are some character studies that you can do? Because what I would probably, go on.
I would say, okay, what are the 5 seminal events in your character's life that happened before the story started, and why are they seminal? You know, give me 5 scenes in the character's life that are absolutely critical to understanding who that character is, you know, before the story started. Have your character write a 1-page letter to their friend telling them the secret they've never told them, the thing that, you know, whatever, those kinds of things. It's just ways of throwing the writer into the character. But those things I'm always after are the things that are influencing the way the character is. So if it's an event that, you know, was seminal in their lives, why was it seminal in their lives? If seeing their father shooting a puppy that had been given to him by his mother, okay, is a seminal event in that character's life when they were a child, the question I'm interested in is why? How does that affect that character now? So I don't want a lovely dramatic scene about something awful that happened to a character in the past. I want that scene in the description of the character because it tells me how this character behaves today. Because that happened, the character tends to be like this, is what I'm after. So that's what I want those scenes to be, those kinds of questions. So that's where you know, we talked before about character, that's where you go to character. Once you've got a broad idea, your first early ideas of how the story is, I would say, who are these people, why they're like they are? And then once you have that, then I would say scene indexing, which is simply scenes that you think of. I would keep away from linearity at this point, you know, and say, okay, well, I need to start scene 1, I need to work my way through scene 2, 3, 4, you know, the moments in the story. I would just say, okay, what are the moments in the story that you know exist? You know, personally, I'm very big on the idea of what's the last scene, what's the ending. You know, it's difficult to get to a story if you don't know where you're getting to, but you don't have to, but it's really helpful if you are. What are the scenes? If I say to you, okay, go and get a piece of paper, sit down and write a quick 1-line summary of the scenes that you know exist in the story before you've worked out what the story is. But you must know, you probably will know 10 or 15 scenes. Write those down until you can't just write them, until you have to start thinking about them. Okay, because in your mind, you'll have a number of scenes that you just know. I would say write those scenes down, not write the entire scene, but write a quick description of each scene. Okay, because you've got scenes that have just arrived in your imagination. Okay, and you've got to trust that arrival. They're there for a reason.
Yeah, I mean,
too much.
For me, when I've been in writers' rooms, I actually find myself, even in writers' rooms, I mean, just sometimes just collaborating with a co-writer like Chas, as well as a writer's room, like pitching a scene is the way in, right? Oh, this could be a thing. And then suddenly that reveals character. For me, as a writer, scenes reveal character as well as plot. But when they're disconnected from linearity, they're actually more about character and mood and tone and theme.
And those are the scenes that your imagination is throwing up at you. Okay, so and I would just like, just get those down, catch them in a net, and put them down, so from the very beginning. It's really important, chronologically in the process of development on the evolution of a story, to know in the early days of the story, these were the scenes that came to me first. Okay, and trust that instinct. That if those scenes came to you first, they came to you for a reason. Even if you don't use the scenes, even if they don't end up in the story, even if they present you with all sorts of problems, there's a reason they came to you. And you need to. It's not necessarily that you need to use those scenes. You need to know why they came to you. There will be a reason for it, and understand why they came to you. And because you can go back when you're stuck later and things aren't working, go back and explore your story in relation to, that's why I think that scene came to me because of these reasons. Am I being true to those reasons in the story where I am now? And again, that process might make it, oh no, actually, there's something I've not been doing that actually when I first started was something that was very important to me. The feeling of that was very important. So it's important to keep a record of these things. So that's why I would say, just broad sweeps of story. When I say, flow diagrams, it's kind of like, this character comes at the beginning and I don't know why, but they're going to be important at the end. You may not even know at that stage why that character is important at the end. But in your mind, your imagination is saying that character is important at the end. They're going to come back. You may not know the scene they come back in. You may not know why they're coming back. But again, keep the record of, write those things down. Just be respectful of the impulses that are arriving in your imagination at this point. You're not yet trying to kind of beat the story into shape. It's still about allowing the story to emerge.
Just to put this in a physical, that's the wrong word, but an actual context, is most of the scripts I write, I've got a very good idea of the story structure. And as I said, I find the characters later. But one of the early screenplays I wrote, it was off a pitch of someone else who then he gave me the blessing to take the idea and write it into a screenplay. And the pitch was the one person who has the least effect on human history because that person has the least effect on human history, gets hijacked by research scientists from the future. And the only way that person can stop these research scientists from the future hijacking his or her body is by then suddenly changing who they are as a person so that they have an effect on human history. And so I had this great premise, and I knew what the beginning of the story was, and I knew what the end of the story was. But the details of who that actual person was and what the individual scenes were in the middle was completely absent. And the only way, and look, I wrote this was like, I think my second or third feature. So it's quite a long time ago and I didn't have the skills that I have now. But the only way I could end up at a draft that I could then end up redrafting was, like you're saying, what are the scenes that I imagine happening in this story? And I just went and wrote these scenes, and it ended up sort of collating into this almost 250 page document that I could then start sort of chipping away into a story and a singular kind of idea. But that's not how I normally work, but I had to work differently depending on what my inspiration was to tell this story.
Thing to realize too about these lists, these kinds of documents, is that, they're in a kind of chronology here. But each of these documents has a different process and a different function, a different value, and you can go back to them at any point. You can go back in between third and fourth draft and do the character studies. You can whenever you like. It's not like you do this and then that's done once, and it's also not like you do it in this order. This is a kind of standard kind of order to take us through chronologically. But they do them when you feel like you want to do them. This is why it's important to know how each of these kinds of short documents works and what they do, because it just instinctively go, I need to do that now. I need to do that. This is why you have to keep trying to use documents that you're not comfortable with in order to realize their value. So, once you've been doing it for a while, it becomes almost instinctive. I need to go back and do that. I need to do this. That's what I need. If I really want to get to the bottom of that, I'm going to have to do this. And you're familiar with the documents. So once you've got that familiarity, you can play with them. And it is like knowing at the gym what you want to be working on, what part of your body you want to be strengthening. And it's that, obviously to look at me, you can tell I hang out in gyms all the time. So I'm an absolute
The three men who've never been to a gym talking about gyms as a metaphor.
Yeah.
Okay.
Should we?
Sorry.
Should we? No. I mean, this is all good because it actually shows you how detailed this is. I'm going to reshare it, but with like clear annotations because we're going on. Is that coming up? Okay, cool. Going on from C indexing and flowing to the one-page synopsis, right? And I can see the C indexing being a nonlinear form and the value of that. And I'm assuming at this point, the idea of going to the one-page synopsis is to make a more linear version of that. To take the cards, the charts, the flow diagrams, and go, okay, now I got to stick them into some kind of order.
Yeah, and the synopsis is pushing you towards plot. You know, because a synopsis always, you know, the one-page linear synopsis is pushing you, is what happens, followed by what happens, followed by what happens. But hopefully by now you have a pretty rich idea of the people in the story. So you're beginning to get that balance, even in your one-page synopsis, which is very hard, to get across a sense of character, even as the events of the story are happening. So you know that I need to, this event doesn't really make sense. The description of what happens doesn't really make sense unless I tell the reader also about this person. You know, this person is an idiot, therefore that's what happens. You know, the reason that moment in the story happens the way that it does is because the person acting at that point is a fool. And that sense of that, the fool, the person being a fool, is necessary in your synopsis, i.e. a character description, to make sense of the action. So you even in the one-page synopsis, you are combining kind of notions of character with action. And then simply the act outlines, for me, is you're starting to ask a much more simple structural question, profound structural question in act outlines, which is, for me, I've used 3 acts, 3 stages. It's simply what's the beginning, what's the middle, and what's the end. You know, and that once you start to get to act outlines, I'm trying to work out, okay, if you have an act outline, I know where the end of the beginning is, because I can't talk about the opening act unless I know where the end of the beginning is. So that's divided my story into beginning, middle, and end. So you're simply asking the simple questions: where's the beginning, where's the middle, where's the end? And as you ask those questions, then you start to ask a simpler question, which is, where's the beginning of the beginning, where's the middle of the beginning, where's the end of the beginning? And you're simply asking the same question and the same with the middle. Where's the beginning of the middle, where's the middle of the middle, where's the end of the middle? And the same with the end. You know, and so you're just beginning, you know, to use a word overused in the last few sentences, you're starting to block out the story in very broad terms, in terms of, you know, beginning, middle, and end, and acts. And so now we get a sense, you're beginning to get a sense of the shape of the story. Or alongside that, sorry, go on.
It's just me sharing my way of thinking about it, if it's helpful for other writers, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, the importance of the midpoint, the reversal. So what is the beginning? This is the start, then there's a big shift, and then there's the resolution. And that what is beginning, the middle, and the end, as you say, it's over the whole story, and then you can subdivide your first act, your second act, and your third act. So I'll tend to start with beginning, middle, and end of the first act, beginning, middle, end of the second act. Like, I'll have the overall idea, but then that's it. So it ends up breaking down into 6 sequences for me, more commonly than 8. Right.
And then, you know, and absolutely within those questions, if I'm going to ask what's the beginning, middle, and end, I need to know as well, in order for that thing to cohere for me, and when I'm looking at other people's work, is okay, what's for example, the plot question that is asked in the beginning section that drives the entire story and is resolved at the end. So if I'm asking what's the beginning, middle, end of the story, I'm also asking what's the connection between the beginning, the middle, and the end. So how is the whatever you want to call it, the hook or the inciting incident or the central dramatic question is how I would describe it. When is the central dramatic question of the story posed? At what point in the beginning? And when is it answered, and how is it answered? And then I would also, if the question that I would regard as a central dramatic question of the story is a plot question, I would then ask a different question, which is, what is the central character question of the story? Now that I know that the story is driven by a overall plot question, then what is the central character question that also is in debate through the story for the main character?
Because I'm glad you raised that, Stephen, because I mean, one of the things we had a preliminary chat yesterday, trying to somehow condense this huge topic into a manageable podcast, but you expressly mentioned there are certain types of story that certain documents lend themselves towards, and most of the ones we're talking about are plot-driven ones. And you are also, you've done a lot of research into different types of stories that are not necessarily plot-driven. And the example that I nearly always reach for, which is unfair because I'm not its creator, but Stu, you've already mentioned it in this stream, so I'm going to mention it now, is your Crimes of Southern Australia
okay, cool.
project. It's an anthology story, much like other projects, like to tell me if I'm wrong here, but stories like Traffic or Contagion, just to lean on Soderbergh version.
Hyperlink cinema, but this specifically is not those things, because Contagion, as we talked about, has a central antagonist as the unifying element, and Traffic has that kind of cause and effect. You know, look at the plot affecting this. Love actually is the weirdest reference, which is why we say Crimes actually, it's unified by theme and place and time rather than a plot element like Contagion or Traffic.
But in that story, there would be neither a central dramatic question necessarily, nor a central character question. Like each of the individual characters and stories you're telling, what you have is a central thematic question.
Yes.
All the stories have been in the current development process for that. We've actually written out and broken down the stories individually. And then it's how they're unified over time. And then we're using the understanding of how the audience is going to experience the linearity of that film to kind of decide what scenes are submerged and what ones they experience, right? And there's rules of thumbs for that project. And who knows if it's going to be effective? It's going to take us a long time to write. But there's decisions that we are not going to get into the procedural detail, because that's not what it's about. It's about the key decisions that characters make. That's what we're going to show the audience. But yes.
I mean, look, I'm not trying to, like, the vast majority of stories that English language speakers write are going to somehow cleave to this idea of there's a central dramatic question, there's a central character question and things like that. But even one of our patrons, Leanne, who's in the Zoom, she's asked, given, Stephen, your studies into gender and power, how may they be alternatives to the hero's journey, which are more authentic to lived experience? And like Stu and I, we're editing the melodrama episode that we've done with you. So we feel like that episode will answer a lot of these questions. But in terms of short documents, I just want to look quickly at...
Yeah, absolutely. If you have like some talk about Stu's document or other kinds of stories that are not driven in the same, you know, if you have characters in your story that are not, you know, the notion of a central dramatic plotted question assumes that the character at the center of the story has the integrity to drive the action of the story. They have the power to make the difference in the story. So if you say, well, what about stories which don't have characters that have that kind of a character, and the people who are disempowered, who don't have power? Well, very often what you're making the audience realize, or the question you're asking the audience is not a kind of plotted question, will this person do that? It's more of a thematic question. How do people like this function in the world? You know, and that's not a question that is directly relevant to the characters in the story. The characters in the story are being used to illustrate that question in the mind of the audience. So in that sense, for these kinds of stories, the question is not tied to character directly. Will this person do that? And it's not tied to plot directly. Will this person do that? And it's not necessarily tied to character directly. Will this person come to understand that? Which would be your character question. It's more of a thematic question, is how do people like this manage? How do people like this make their way? If you think of a Ken Loach movie, you know, a Ken Loach story, broadly speaking, without, you know, generalizing all his films, generally shows an individual person, a representative of a class, of an underclass very often, struggling to make something of their lives when faced with opposing blunt forces that are simply set against them. The system is against them. And what the purpose of the story is, in terms of what's the question of the story, it's more of a question of Ken Loach to the audience, which is, do you realize this is the kind of world we're making for people? And do you realize how difficult our society makes life for many people? That's the question that drives the story. If in your story synopsis, when we're saying, what's the question in that story, I say, you know, I would imagine the writer is saying, that's the question the story has. And so what you ask about the events of the story is, how do the things that we're seeing as story progresses, bring us to the realization of that question. So, for example, Ken Loach may be someone who believes that the individual is oppressed by an overarching system that will never allow them the freedom they really need in the current situation until we have a revolution. That may be his belief, but in his stories, the sense of the hopelessness of life doesn't come through in those stories until the end of the story. He's very careful to show that character with an objective, with a plotted objective. You know, Raining Stones, my absolute favorite. Will the father get the confirmation dress for his daughter? That's a plot question. The answer is no, he won't be successful because the system is against him. And watching that film, you kind of go, he never had a chance. Because how could a man like that in that situation ever have a chance? And so you're asking that overall question that Loach wants you to be asking, but it's done with an under that overarching question, which is a, if you like, thematic political question, you still have that plotted question. So, and that's going to be in order to make you get to that realization. So if you have your thematic question, like so Stu is talking about, if it's like crime actually, you know, if you look at love actually, say what's the thematic, you know, love is everywhere and it makes everything worthwhile. It's kind of like a thematic statement of that film. If Stu's doing crime actually, you say crime is everywhere and it's in the nature of life. You can never get away from it.
That's it. That's exactly what we're trying to show. We're contrasting the people doing abhorrent crimes with just minutia or minute corruption in everyday lives. You know, to use the example of social. Yeah.
The question you're plotting in that story is how do the individual stories that I'm joining together in my film, in my story, bring the audience to that realization at the end that crime is everywhere, it's just a part of life. You know, so you have a so the individual, what happens in each individual story is not the primary question. The primary question is how, by showing what happens in every story, will I bring the audience to the realization of the thematic idea that I want them to understand? So that's your overarching question. Again, just to write your synopsis, your one page, you need to know that's the question. You know, you need to know that's how my story works. And then that doesn't make it easy to write a one-page thematic synopsis. No. Because the one-page synopsis is completely against the notion of complex theme, because it's driving towards linear simplicity. So the document is, you know, you're kind of swimming upstream in a one-page synopsis. But knowing that, you can still have a crack. You know, you can still have a go.
I think for us, what the approach that we took, and I'm not saying it's successful, but the approach was Will pitching more the thematic idea and kind of made that the emphasis, and then kind of alluded to what the stories were without going into the detail of the plotting of those stories. So those stories are tightly plotted. Because the one thing that I've found, you know, and in my experience is just my experience, and I'm hardly successful, but that I have learned in pitching projects that every project that you pitch is going to be different in how you pitch it from the selling point of view. And naturally, and unsurprisingly, that's different. Also, every project's different in terms of how you develop it as well. That you kind of have for me, I've got a process that then I kind of modify based on the needs of the project, and you kind of listen to it. And that I learn by going to film markets and just meeting people and what I call soft pitching, where I'm just talking to a producer or a friend and be like, oh, I'm working on this thing. You can kind of get a sense of how you talk about it and what gets people's attention, right? And we may know what we're doing, you know, over here in terms of developing the story, we may know what we're doing, but then we've got to work out how to articulate that to a potential buyer. But at the same time, a buyer is just another way of saying first audience, right? There's still an audience of your story that we can have a very abstract idea, but if we can't execute it, then it doesn't really matter what our idea is.
Which is a good argument for taking all of your individual short documents we're talking about and just trying them out on people. You know, rather than sitting in your room and, you know, working that and then go from this document to this document, this document. So when you have a notion of that document, go and find someone and talk to them about it. Just say, can I describe something to you? And kind of pitch them your one page or whatever. And just again, see reactions. It's always the important thing is always, as you say, to go out and present to people, because each of these documents is really a way of exploring your story. So you need to get a response as often as you can to those different ways of exploring. So don't be, you know, too enclosed. Don't sit in a room and go through these things one after another. Do some work on some document. Go and find some people. Talk about it to them. See what response is. Come back and, you know, use that response in your movement to the next document.
Okay, so I think we're going to Like, I think what's interesting is that one-page synopsis moving into the outline is, for me, the act outline. If you're doing a TV show, it's going from the show synopsis, the one page, this is the show, to episode breakdowns, right? And then when you suddenly, in my mind, if you go like, oh, that's manageable, right? And then I assume after act outlines, you might go sequence outlines, right?
Yes.
Whatever kind of structure is. But I do want to talk a little bit, and maybe we talk about it later, step outline, because I think you've got a very specific idea of what a step outline is. That would be different from how I think about
it. We will come to that if we
It feels like then the next biggest point is probably talking about the story synopsis, because that's something that you've mentioned that is different from other sorts of documents. Because I understand, we'll talk about the step outline in detail. We've talked about the synopsis, and I'm assuming the synopsis for you in this version is like 3 to 4 pages.
Yeah.
It's a longer, more detailed version, or less. Okay.
Yeah. 3 pages, really. For synopsis, I don't see. I'm not a big fan of anything over 3 pages for synopsis.
Okay.
I think you should be able to do it in 3 pages.
Okay. Why is that? I'm curious. Chas and I have talked about this, right? We had a whole thing where we're saying like a 3 to 4 page document seems like a good length, but that was just purely instinct.
A synopsis is weighted towards plot. It's a kind of plot. It's much more a plot summary than anything else, even though hopefully it will be characterful. And plots described over more than 3 pages, I just get bored by them. I don't think you need 5 pages to describe a plot to me. It's if you imagine, one way of thinking about it is, imagine someone's reading it out to you. How long does it take to read out 5 pages? Okay, imagine you're walking, imagine you meet a friend in a pub and they say, saw a great film yesterday, and you go, yeah, what's it about? And they spend 5 pages telling you. You're like, oh, for God's sake, I don't, just tell me. I didn't mean, I didn't want to walk through, and it's the same situation. If you've got a story and you want to tell me stories about, if I want to know what it's like in forensic detail, I will read a longer document. If you just, a synopsis is simply this is what the story is, and it's punchy and it's impactful, and it makes me curious and it makes me want more. And the other thing to remember, all short documents is, one of the jobs of a short document is to make the listener or the reader want more. Okay, so the job of a treatment is for the person with treatment to say, yeah, I need to read the script. I really want to read the script. Having read this, I want to read the script. Having read your synopsis, I want to read a treatment. Having read your log line, I want to read a synopsis.
But that's the difference between these documents as a selling document as opposed to a development document.
Well, no, even as a development document. The thing is, as Stu just said, you're selling the story every time you write it. In the early days of short documents, you're selling it to yourself. You're kind of going, okay, I've got this idea for a story. Let me get me some kind of, I'll write a paragraph. Does that? And then you look at it and go, I don't know. I'm not, it's not about, I don't know if I can do that. I don't know if it's possible to make an interesting story. You don't know that yet. When you read your first paragraph you've written for yourself, you're kind of saying, do you want to carry on with this? Do you have the excitement? Does it bite you the way that a story needs to, if you're going to spend the next 4 years of your life working on a story? Are you excited by what you've just written? So in that sense, the first paragraph description for yourself is selling yourself the story. So you're always selling. It becomes more formalized and more business-like later down the line. But there's always that aspect of, I want more. When I read that, it excites me.
Maybe the way to think about it is like a small I investment. Is this idea worth investing more of my time in?
Yeah.
Because we know that the journey to get a film, not just to write a screenplay, but then to take the film, is a long fucking journey, right? Mm-hmm. So every stage is convincing yourself to, gambler, the gambler's fallacy, sunk cost fallacy. But it's about convincing yourself to continue doing it. And the better you are at understanding short documents, the earlier you might be able to kind of pull out of a bad project or steer it in a new direction, so you don't write 3 drafts before you finally realize what your story problem is, and you've invested way too much time in writing those drafts and perhaps got no more gas in the tank. Where if you worked out early on something that maybe then you could get a first draft that's better. That's the stuff that interests me. I want to be able to hand in a good first or second draft that is quote unquote producible, and maybe it got some work, but you can actually shoot it,
But the other thing is also, do you have enough? Is there something in the story? And this is why the earlier you can get through this, the better. if a lot of people turned around to you and said, that's not going to work, would you have enough confidence? Would there something in the story say, I know you're smart, I know the points you've made are good, I know that it looks like that to you, but you're wrong. You know, that's what I'm looking for in the early short documents. That thing that makes you go. I always, you know, Dylan Thomas. I always use this phrase. A beautiful poem he wrote, which is called "The force that through the green fuse drives the flower." Okay, he's talking about plant. The force that through the green fuse drives the flower. Your early short documents are looking to identify for yourself the force that through the green fuse drives the flower. You know, the story's got to be written. There's got to be but there's got to be that force inside it, that impetus for you that makes you go. Everyone I've talked to in the last 3 months has said really good, smart, negative things about this story, but I'm not going to stop. You know, I still believe in it. Now, it's true that some people think that about the story and they're wrong, and they waste 6 years of their life. Okay, but if you don't have that belief in your own work and your own story, if you don't think there's something valuable for it, you will run out of energy with your own story. It'll become tiresome to you. You know, it's and your early documents, you're looking to nail that, not necessarily go, I know exactly why I feel that, but you're looking to go, yeah, it makes me feel, when I read that I've just written, it makes me feel that. And that power and instinctive energy that exists in the story is something that you have to preserve as you go on writing for years and years and years. That's why I love this thing about the premise in the tin. You know, when you get bored and tired and the story makes no sense and everyone's telling you it doesn't work, go and open that tin and smell the sea and remember there was a reason why you wanted to do this, and see if it's still there. You know, because that's what's ultimately, it sounds romantic and nonsensical, but ultimately that's what gets the story made. You know, and that commitment the writer has to the story.
There are scripts that I have that I've written just for me because no one else has reacted to them positively, and I still hope to do them one day. But
sorry, I'm just waiting. I'm laughing loud enough so it cuts to me to see me just laughing, cackling at you.
In terms of like just going way back to the beginning, you telling the story over and over again. Yes, it gives you an idea whether your story is working. Yes, it gives you an idea whether it's something to pursue. But I also think it just teaches you what other people find attractive about your story.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily whether the things that you were wanting to tell previously that are important to you should fall out of the story. It's just that they are not what is going to hook other people into your story.
Absolutely, and you know, but it's still about taking that spark. You know, it's you're not writing a screenplay for you. You're writing it for an audience. I'm an absolute believer in this. You know, the story doesn't belong to you, but there has to be something in that story. That's what I mean about, you know, as you say, when you tell it to people, you begin to alter it. You begin to, you know, it's affected by the audience and the response to the story, as it should be, because your job is, as it were, take the story to an audience, not to, you know, it's not a selfish process. But you still have to have that thing in the story that makes you work, you know, that keeps you going, and that kind of internal spark. And exactly how that story arrives in the audience of mine is affected by the responses, and the way these documents work will change and evolve it. And that's the process too. So you're not saying it's about preserving something. It's about keeping the underlying, as it were, I think it's to do with the theme. I think it's to do with what it's really about. You know, there's many ways of telling a story and keeping that what it's really about to do the same thing. And what it's really about for you, the writer, may not ultimately be what it's really about for the audience. But knowing what it's really about and what drives you through the story process is, I think, really important. Otherwise, it simply becomes a technical process. It becomes hack work. It becomes being really good at being technical.
So to go back to my earlier question, what short documents are really good at helping you? I mean, you've mentioned the premise. Yeah. But to build out, non-plot ideas.
If we go to the story synopsis, this thematic document, because we talked a lot about plotting documents. Stu, if you click through on the slides, we can get through to the.
We'll skip the premise.
Yeah, we've talked about that. This is to do with witness, but we may come back to that if we have time. Okay, so that's your okay. That's your actually we'll go. Sorry, let's stick with the premise for witness for a minute because it helps what we're talking about.
Yeah.
We go back to the first, the little slide. Go back a couple of them. Okay.
Yeah, look, it's cut. Like, give me 2 seconds, and I'll just change the font size.
Okay.
I've tried to make it into draft 0 branding, and obviously that
it doesn't really matter. We were talking about the premise, which is the initial idea, as opposed to before it's worked out too much. The premise comes to the writer in whatever form the writer tends to think, how you tend to think. So it's really, there are different ways. A premise can be a philosophical notion. How do I talk about this idea or whatever? If that's the way your mind works as a writer, that's fine. There isn't we're not talking about the premise as shaped for the outside world, for the outside audience. It's just beginning to write it down for you to get to the essence of what the story is for you in a very compressed form. If we start to write this down, as I said, for me, a premise is also a bunch of things in an old tobacco tin. But when you say, okay, well, take all those things that are in that tobacco tin and write a quick, a very short description of what the story is. What you're after is what it actually is. If we go to the witness description, Stu, okay, so there are different ways you can think about a premise and a theme in terms of a biblical thing. If you want to, you can think about it philosophically. I'm looking at this in relation to the film Witness. You can say, thematically, we could write a premise of Witness, which is to do with the triumph of love and community. Biblically, you say the premise of what I'm really interested in is the conflict from the Old Testament to the New Testament.
Or you could broader do like biblically coming to horror films because there's something that Chas and I are interested in. Like it's the morality play or the kind of what is the message, and I think that's really useful because there's a lot of conversations about what is theme, and some people, it should be telling how people how to live their lives. But for me, sometimes theme is just like the thing that binds it together, and these are more useful ways of breaking it down and also kind of represent your biases in a good way, your voice as a writer. Some writers are going to lead into the biblical aspect, or they might make it more spiritual, and others are going to be more philosophical about it, and others are going to be more intellectual, and some people are going to be more touchy.
You're asking the question of yourself, what is it, what is it in this story that I find interesting, that motivates me? You're not saying, it's not an audience question, it's where am I starting? I just help you to identify that for yourself. Okay, so if we jump to the next.
Cool.
Okay, so what we're looking to do is it's exploring the impulse. Okay, and once you've got that notion of what it is, then you can look at Witness and say, how do I write the premise of Witness in kind of slightly plotted terms? And what we're looking to do is, this question I would say is try and keep it to 25 words or less. So it's really compressed, and the process of compressing it means you're kind of pushing to the absolute center of what you're interested in, because you don't have enough space to kind of be more discursive and talk about too many different ideas. So you're just taking your approach to it and then saying, how do I kind of boil it down? And boiling it down is, for me, a really good way of thinking about it. It's kind of like making really good gravy. You take the juices of the meat. Sorry for your vegan and vegetarian audiences. The same is true of like vegetable stock. You boil up a whole bunch of things, and then you reduce and reduce, and you boil away everything until you're left with this incredibly potent essence. It's like in Grasse in the south of France. They have this huge rose harvest every year, the center of the French perfume industry, and they grow thousands of roses, and then they boil them until you get like the essence of 80,000 roses is contained in a tiny little bottle. And that tiny little bottle of rose essence is used by thousands and thousands of perfume manufacturers in order to get the smell of the rose as one of the various odors in their perfume. So you're taking something and boiling it to its absolute quintessence, and that's what I think your premise is trying to do. So if we look at the one I've said for Witness, which is just my version of it, it's not Peter Weir's version, but is this is kind of fundamentally, as it were, it's the connection. Doing it like this shows the connection in the middle. It's approaching a log line because it has the kind of what happens and who's the main character in it. But it's not really fundamentally. This line at the middle of it, hiding the cock finds his true self, and saves the boy. That's what's you wouldn't necessarily have in a log line. It's that connection between the transformation of the policeman and his ability to save the boy. His ability to save the boy is not because of what he does, it's because of who he has become, and his understanding, therefore, of what to do given what he has become. So that's for me, the fundamental idea of Witness is the reconciliation of opposites within the main character. I would say that for me, Witness is kind of it's a philosophical exploration of duality, and I think the film is full of duality, and John Book reconciles dualities within himself, and therefore the story can resolve. So for me, it's a kind of, if you like, it's a dramatization of a philosophical argument. So that's what, for me, and that it doesn't matter whether Peter Weir feels this to be true, or whether indeed you feel it to be true. If I'm writing Witness, that's what's true for me. And the question is, how do I then manifest that in the story? How do I keep hold of this idea? And then as the story unfolds through document after document after document, how do I stay true to that? Because that's the essence for me. And that's what this notion of the premise is. It's the essence for the writer. Everyone else gets their share later. Then you move to, sorry, you can show that slide.
Yeah.
Then you move to your more formal logline, where you're moving the story away from, as it were, this fundamental essence for the writer into something that the audience can see, the readers, the people that you're going to be bringing the story to, and you're going to make it more linear, and you're going to start bringing in plot, and you're going to start bringing in the world of the story in more detail. And this logline is taking it. It's again, it's slightly extended. The logline will be a little bit shorter than this, but you see what you're doing is, you're naming the logline is fundamentally who's the main character, what's his problem, how does he deal with it. That's how I would characterize a logline. Identify the main character, the protagonist of the story, normally. Their essence. John Book is a good cop. That's that's all you need to know about this guy. He's a good cop. He finds an Amish boy, so you need to bring in the world of the Amish. And he witnessed a murder, so that's the beginning of the story. The middle of the story, which is the middle paragraph or the middle sentence, he retreats the boy to the Amish country, and this is where the character story comes in. So this is where you bring it in, where he has to adjust to life with the Amish and his feelings for the boy's mother. So his feelings for the mother, which take up the most of the audience's interest in the middle of the story. And then finally, John Book's relationship with the Amish. This is connecting the evolution of the character internally. His relationship with the Amish allows him to defeat the killers when they arrive, which is more plot. And then once his work is done, he must go and leave his new life and the mother behind. So that's the resolution of the story. So it's the log line in knowledge of what you know about the premise and how you're interested in, what the story is essentially about for you, starts to delineate the story in a more plotted and sensible way for the external reader and the external in a way for the external world. You're beginning to take your fundamental idea, which is the premise, and you're beginning to lay it out in a way that gives it a kind of linearity and a thematic and plotted sense and a character and sense of an evolution of character. So the logline is the place where that first starts to happen. From here, you can move on to more longer versions of the story.
Yeah,
and in those various longer versions, you explore different aspects of the story.
This is a little bit different from the American style logline, which is going to be more one sentence, but essentially it's the same idea. Main character, usually in the Americans, they'll add a personality, a good, but something some kind of complication.
Yeah.
It's essentially the same idea, and just broken into 3 paragraphs, which I think is actually makes it easier to follow. I think sometimes people are so obsessed with these one sentence log lines, they sacrifice clarity of intent for conciseness, if you know what I mean.
The other thing to think about in terms of short documents is you need to be aware of the reality of the industry within which you work. One of the reasons that I find this really, one of the problems I have with pitching in the sense that, one second, I've got to let my dog out. My dog is come on, out.
All right. Just for the sake of the podcast, I'm just going to read the log line for the moment. Just so we've got an audio recording, which is Witness. John Book, a good cop, must protect a young Amish boy who has witnessed a murder. He retreats with the boy to the Amish country, where he has to adjust to life with the Amish and his feelings for the boy's mother. John Book's relationship with the Amish allows him to defeat the killers when they arrive. But once his work is done, he must go and leave his new life and the mother behind. What is interesting is that you've actually, and I'm sure this is to a degree conscious, you've answered the plot question and then answered the character question in the context of the logline.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things to think about pitching, and why I've had it slightly long, just as an aside really, I don't want to talk about it for too long, is that the kinds of short documents that you use depend on the nature of the industry that you're in. You know, one of the reasons that pitching is very important is it's used in environments where there are an awful lot of projects and an awful lot of decisions have to be made very quickly. So in somewhere like Los Angeles, where there are thousands and thousands of projects floating around and people always trying to, you know, get projects moving, and there's a large amount of money and a large number of companies are commissioning work, then there's a very fast turnover of projects and fast turnover of ideas, and the pitch is absolutely suited, ideally, for that kind of high pressure, high volume environment. If you have an agency that has 100 projects a year, I don't know why they use pitches. You know, it's an industrial. Pitching is an industrial process. It's an industrial. What's the word process? It's an industrial pitching
response.
Industrial response to the nature of the industry. So the kinds of short documents that you ought to be using should be understood in the context of the industry within which you work. If you were an agency which had 5 people in your orbit, for example, to use an absurd example, if all you had to do was to service 5 people who wanted to write screenplays or wanted to write television series, and you're an agency, you would get them in and you would talk to them for a day each in a week. Okay, that would be your process. You wouldn't say, go away and write me a treatment, because if you say to 5 people, go away and write me a treatment, what are you going to do for the month it takes them to write the treatment? You're doing nothing if you are this mythical agency. So your process relates to the kinds of people you're working with, the numbers of people you're working with, how much money you have, you know, what your, as it were, plotted, what your defined objectives are as an organization, all of those things.
Yeah.
So this is one of my big bugbears about short documents and the industry across the world, is that the commercial industry in Hollywood has a very different set of principles and objectives than the agencies around Europe and other English-speaking countries, which have a different set of objectives. They're not only there to make money, okay, which is a fundamental objective of a Hollywood studio, is to make money.
In fact, you might argue that that's the lowest of all their objectives.
So how are their processes of story development and short document use different, given the objective different? So when one person comes and says, you need to do this because that's what distributors do, you know, you go, yeah, I can see the value of doing it because it trains you up for the process when you need to talk to distributors. But if you're not necessarily a distributor, if you're a different kind of organization, in what way do your short document uses change? You know, I think people have to be aware that it's not a canon of an inherited canon. You need to adapt and change, and people do. But it's, for me, a constant debate needs to be had about the nature of short documents and what kinds of organizations use what kinds of short documents in what way. It's not a set thing, and it changes over time. And it also changes based on what technology is available.
Do you think we could, given that you're segueing naturally into pitching and selling, before we distinguish between selling to a funding agency as opposed to selling to a market, can we just talk broadly about, you're a writer and you've written all these short documents to get to a screenplay, and you've written your screenplay and you've gotten feedback and it's great and you're ready to go to market. Now, how do these same named documents, in particular treatments, I guess, but outlines are another one, how are these documents to be written differently if you're trying to sell your story as opposed to trying to figure out how your story works?
It's a terrific question. It's really simple. You need to think more about the nature of selling itself. You know, before you sit out to write a document that is going to sell your story to somebody, you need to think abstractly for a little while at least, about the nature of selling, and think about how salespeople work. You know, selling in terms of what are you selling in terms of a story? when you're selling it to a distributor, or when you're selling it to a commercial funder, or getting yourself an agent, even in the early stages, is it's about selling the idea of the thing rather than the thing itself. If you want to buy a Rolls Royce and you walk into a Rolls Royce dealership, and you obviously have the money to buy a Rolls Royce, the guy that's selling you the Rolls Royce is not going to start talking to you about the engine capacity and how the thing looks under the hood. He's not going to say, look, if you want to buy this Rolls Royce, let me open the bonnet for you so you can see the engine, and let me explain to you how this engine works, which is what you do with a detailed discussion of story with a treatment. You're saying to people involved, look, this is how the story is. Let me lift the hood up and show you how it works. When you're selling a Rolls Royce to someone, you say to them, do you want to sit inside it? Do you want to have a drive? Just drive it round the block for 2 or 3, times. And then when the guy comes back in, or the woman comes back in, the salesman says, you look pretty good in that car. Did you enjoy it? That's what selling is about. It's selling the idea of being that person. You're not selling the thing, you're selling the idea of the thing. The old saying that people have of, sell the sizzle, not the sausage.
Yeah.
That's that notion of, you're not selling the thing itself, you're selling the idea of it, which is to say, there's a problem with detail. The problem with detail is you're kind of getting into the nature of the thing itself, whereas what you're really selling is the idea of the thing. And that is really worth remembering when it comes to sort of selling your story, which is why, for example, distributors are not interested in 20-page treatments. That's not what they're after. They're after the distributor who's looking at your stories going, what have I got to sell? And you should be able to give me that in 2-3 pages, maybe even less, because that's what they're doing. They're selling the idea. Now, later on, they will get involved in the detail, and they will be usually very, very good at the detail. But when you approach them with your work, they're not going, I need to look under the hood. They're going, what's the idea I can sell? Okay, and so when you're writing a treatment, that's the answer. That's the question you have to answer. When you're writing much more likely an outline, a synopsis of 3 pages. What's the idea you're selling, and why would that idea be attractive to this person?
So we did somewhat of a pre-chat on this, but to bring this back into the practical. So, and I've got to be somewhat careful because I know the producer of this particular project is in the YouTube, is watching the YouTube live stream, is we have a true life project. And the documents that I had to write for that project in terms of a treatment was, how do I choose which events in this person's life to keep and not to keep? Like, I had to figure out, what is the story I'm telling? I had to go plot. How do I break this down to scenes, sequences, et cetera, and ended up with almost a 20-page document that is all very plotty. We then use that document, which is incredibly detailed, to apply to the buyer, but in this instance, it was an Australian screen agency, for please fund us on the basis of this document that we've outlined. Now, the feedback that they gave us back on that document was, oh, I didn't feel the big intense character moments that I should have felt. And I got like, but that's what the screenplay is for. We're asking you to pay us money to take us from this treatment to the screenplay so you can feel those things, rather than expect to feel them from a treatment, which goes back to our earlier point about it being a literary document. And
then you have to what if you read behind a comment like that, because this is where it gets technical, where we say, okay, we can hopefully be practically useful rather than talking in more general terms.
Yes.
When someone says, for example, I didn't feel the kind of big character moments, one of the things they're saying in that comment is, I was drawn into the detail, and because I was having to follow the detail, because you said here's 20 pages and it goes bang, and in order to read that document, it's a close read. You have to follow it, and you have to concentrate hard. So what you're doing in the reading of a treatment like that is you're concentrating hard on following the close detail of the evolution of a character's life as it's described to you. That doesn't allow you much time to think in the abstract. It doesn't allow you much time to, if you sit back from a treatment like that and think about it for a minute, and then you go back in, you have to go back 3 pages to pick up the thread, because the detail is such that you can't just come out and go back in. And that's one of the issues with treatments, is that what people say they want from a treatment is not what they want from treatment. Okay, people say what they want from a treatment is a really good detailed breakdown of the story. Okay, so they understand what it is you're writing. Well, that's not true. What they want is a really interesting emotional experience of reading. What they want is to put the treatment down and feel moved. Okay, they don't really care about the detail. They say they do because that's what they're told the treatment is. What they want is an experience. What they want is an experience that is much more like reading a short story than it is reading a film treatment. Okay, a short story is an incredibly complex, crafted, beautifully written story which has as an objective in the writing of it to make the reader feel. Okay, that's what the objective of a short story writer is. A treatment is told to you as a document that is a technical story document that allows the reader to understand what the story is. That's what they tell you. What they want is the literary experience. And that's when you're writing a treatment for the outside world, your main objective should be not how do I accurately describe the story I'm writing in the screenplay in a compressed form. Your main question should be, how do I make the reader feel something?
Exactly.
Okay, that's what you're writing.
And what I mean, Stu and I have discussed this in previous episodes, is when you write such a detailed treatment, what the readers then start to think about is what's not in the treatment, rather than being invited in to go, what's the experience of this? And I feel that I'm not regretting having written that 20-page document. I needed that 20-page document to figure out how to write the screenplay. But in terms of a selling document, it was a terrible document, and that I feel like I should have submitted something that was 4 pages all about feeling and theme and big moments.
What you're after is having the reader read your document and feel, as they're reading the story of this life, what must it have been like to be that person at that moment? Not what's going to happen next, what are the ideas, what's the, you want them to be emotionally identifying with that character. Oh my God, that's what they're feeling. Oh my God, that's what, oh my God, look, that's amazing. What must it have been like to be there at that moment when they realized that and that everything had changed, and they're emotionally engaged with the character. And then, so then you move from the technical process of writing your outline documents and your scene by scene documents, your breakdown documents are all about breaking the story into a comprehensible set of scenes that relate to each other, that kind of all tie together, that will allow you to write a screenplay. And then you come to your treatment for the selling treatment. And what you then have to do is kind of put that to one side and go, okay, what's the essential story the audience will feel their way through? And how do I describe that to people? And one of the things that you don't do is have too much detail. This is why your 20-page treatment is a killer, because there's already, it doesn't really matter how good how well worked out the story is. It's too much detail. It will become at 20 pages this, then this, then this, then this, because you're kind of summarizing scenes. You're not taking the audience through a kind of a crafted literary journey. You're literally taking them scene by scene through the story, which is very useful technically, and shows a skilled treatment reader should know that all the work you've done, but they're still not getting that emotional rush. And people make decisions on stories based on the emotional rush more than they do on treatments, on the close analysis. So I would say you pull back on the detail. And in terms of technical stuff, when it comes to treatment writing, I would say be really aware that detail at the kind of most forensic level is problematic. Beware of adjectives and adverbs, when you're writing treatments. I always say to people, there are 42 different words in the English language for walk. A character can stride, stroll, meander, perambulate, skip. There's hundreds of words, dozens of words to write the word walk. Okay, but most writers say he walks slowly, he walks quickly, he walks fast. There's a word in the word for walk. Stride means he walks quickly. Okay, so there's one word where two words exist. There's always one word that will do. When you're writing a treatment, and this is the detail that you write, okay, you need to word and say out every word that doesn't matter, every word that can be compressed. you know, because they can. And you can literally, any treatment, give me a treatment of 15 pages, 12 pages in an hour. I don't care what the treatment is, I can do it in an hour through editing, okay? Because I can be that forensic, you know, and it's just about compressing and boiling it down in the way that we were talking about before. That's what you have to do. And if you do that, you begin to allow space to appear in the story. And it's a kind of, you know, again, it's technical. The example I would use is in, you know, the notes is, if you a description of someone walking across the room, an attractive man walks across the room, say, you know, as he walks across the room, his blonde hair flops on his shoulders. Okay, as he walks across the room, his blonde hair flops on his shoulders. He looks gorgeous. Is the kind of phrase you might put in a not very well written treatment. Okay, you can write the same description, which is he walks across the room and every woman looks at him. Okay, which says exactly the same thing, but A, it dramatizes what he is. So you're describing in terms of action. So the fact that he's attractive is described to the audience, the reader, in terms of the action that you're describing rather than the physical description of him. But more than that, the question then is, what does he look like? In the first description, what he looks like is you described him with hair flopping on his shoulders, so he has long hair. So in your story there, your attractive character has long hair. You're defining an attractive man as being long haired, which means that for every member of the audience that thinks that bald men are attractive, you're not playing to their notion of attraction. You know, if you don't describe how long his hair is, then the question, if you ask the question, how long is his hair? The answer is his hair is the length of the hair that any attractive man that the reader finds attractive would have. So the length of his hair is not defined by your writing. The length of his hair is decided by the imagination of the reader, Stu says, as he flops it out his long hair.
Yeah, exactly. So, I'm like, clearly, it's long hair.
So in description, where you give detail, one of the problems of detail in description in a treatment is that it excludes the ideas of the reader. It says, no, I'm going to tell you what this is. You know, and if you say, what's a lovely, I don't know, a nice car, and you name the Ferrari, what happens if I like Fords or if I like, you know, VW Beetles? By telling me that she drives or he drives a Ferrari, and that's supposed to be a desirable car, you're cutting out from that description all the possible desirable cars that other people may feel are desirable. And you're imposing your notion of desirable in your story upon me.
Without the space to reveal that it's relative to, in the case of the car, it's relative to character.
Unless it's vital to the story that it's a Ferrari, you don't say it's a Ferrari. Just don't. But people do all the time. You know, they'll just say, oh, I need to show he's wealthy, so I'll give him a Ferrari. Okay, but that, you know, for me, if someone drives a Ferrari, they're probably an arsehole. That's my view of Ferraris. Okay, now I bring that to your story. So you tell me they drive a Ferrari because you like them and they're successful, and you tell me it's a Ferrari. I have a whole different set of associations with Ferrari than you do. And you don't know what my associations are. You can't know. So every time you put in that kind of detail, you risk me bringing associations that you don't want to the story. Plus, you also exclude me from the possibility of giving the car that I like to the character that you want me to like. If you think about a treatment that doesn't have that sense of detailed care and stripping away of the unnecessary things in the treatment, then what you're doing is you're giving the audience a story that they will understand in a way that you're not entirely in control of. And secondly, you're depriving them of the opportunity to imagine the story. Because you can easily think of a paragraph where you put in 10 different details that aren't necessary. Each of those details that you put in as the writer to your paragraph exclude me from imagining what those details are. So that paragraph you've just written, there are 10 moments when I could imagine your story that you stopped me imagining. Now extend that over 16 pages or 12 pages or 8 pages. There are 130 moments that I could imagine your story that you have stopped me imagining. Okay, it's harder for me to turn down a story that I have helped to imagine than it is for me to turn down a story that you have told me to imagine.
Yeah,
you know, because I may not agree with your imaginations. So in treatment writing, this lack of detail, this creation of what I would call vacuums of description, where you simply leave it out to allow the audience to say, okay, well, if he's walked across the room and every woman in the room has looked at him, then he must look like this, because that's how I imagine an attractive man looks. Okay, astonishingly like me for some peculiar reason. You know, but you know what I mean. So
Yeah.
the reader is imagining that, and that means that they're pulled into the story. So when the reader says to you, "Where was the space for the character's big moments?" They're kind of asking a bigger question, which is, where is the space for me in the story?
Yeah.
You know, you didn't let me come in. Or you know, I had to listen to you telling me the story rather than I had to participate. And any great storyteller, you know, in a pub or in a, you know, when you, a great comedian or a great raconteur tells you a story, and there are kind of details they tell you, and there are details they don't tell you. And those details they don't tell you, you fill in yourself. So the process of being told the story is a process of being told and simultaneously you imagining that story and making it better.
Okay.
Your own use of imagination.
There was
That's what it's about.
a post today on the screenwriting Facebook group. It was one of the good posts on there, which was like, don't tell me something, prove it. Which in the case of, if we are describing it, if Harry is meant in this scene where Harry is walking in, to use your example with the long blonde hair, that doesn't prove anything about the character. It's literally a description. The idea that everyone, you know, that every woman and some men turn and look at him, you know, or he's just one of those people that's so charismatic, is proving who he is. And this idea that in the treatment that often sometimes we get in the mistake of describing intent, and what actually we should be doing is not describing intent or describing like action. We should be describing effect, the relationship of cause and effect, but on a micro level. You know, this character insults this person. You know, it's a lot more driven by relationships, I think.
The critical thing in all of that is, in order to be able to do that in the treatment, you must have worked out the story beforehand. You know, this is the thing about, you know, the treatment, particularly the selling treatment, is you can't write the story in the treatment. You know, in order to have the ability to relax and say, okay, I need to make this stylish. I need to rewrite the treatment, you know, with this way of thinking about a treatment in order for it to play for an audience, for a reading audience. You need to be absolutely confident in the underlying nature of the story. And if you're just writing treatments without your previous short documents, you know, what you're doing in your writing of the treatment is actually trying to solve problems. You're trying to bring out problems in the writing of the treatment. If you use your writer's treatment as your selling treatment, you're trying to write the treatment as a writer's treatment in order to work out what doesn't work. And so, you know, when you write it, and if you get to a lumpy part of the treatment where you're not quite sure, then you start to try and work things out. Then what you're doing is you're using it as a technical document. If you then present that technical document, even if it's polished and worked through as a selling document, it has a different purpose. You know, you really need to go back and say, I need to rewrite this document as a selling document rather than a working document.
I mean, I have no regrets over the existence of that 20-page document.
Yeah.
What I wish we had submitted is, say, perhaps a 4-page document that focuses more on theme and character and structure, rather than this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. Because, and they don't need to, I mean, look, part of my concern is that they then turn around and say, well, you've told us what you want us to feel, but you don't know how to do that. But then I have that 20-page document to turn around and say, well, this is how I'm going to do that. This is how I'm going to tell the story. But I guess the first impression that they got was more of a story document, a plot document, rather than an emotional or a selling document. Because, I mean, I guess at the end of the day, the biggest thing is how to make people feel things are the better selling documents. And to make people feel things is less about plot and more about theme and character.
Yes,
as a broader generalization.
Yeah, there's also a degree of luck in this too. You know, the other thing about, you know, we have to realize is that, you know, you'll send these documents. You know, sometimes you'll send a document that's like this really good selling, open, allow the reader in document, and they'll come back exactly saying, so yeah, it sounds great, but how are you going to do it? You know, and you can get turned down on the basis it sounded great, but there wasn't enough detail. And then you can do the reverse and send the detail without the selling. People come back and say, I didn't feel enough. You know, the thing about short documents is they're imperfect. You know, they're all a poor substitute for the screenplay. You know, when it comes down to it, the screenplay is where you stand or fail.
Yeah,
they're all imperfect.
I mean,
you know, that's the nature of the documents. They're all imperfect. You can't make, you know, they're not the screenplay. All of them, one way or another, are an approximation towards what will become the screenplay.
And it did annoy me. Like the feedback that I was getting from my producer, who had gotten it in turn from the screen agency, was there were all these moments that they wanted to feel things. I'm like, that's what the screenplay is for. Please give us money so that we can go to the screenplay. And my assumption was that they could read this technical document and from that extrapolate whether this was worth investing in. And I think that was my mistake.
I think that is your mistake. Like because I think it's good. So to all the listeners, including those live and listening to this podcast form, Stephen's given us these great slides that we'll turn into a handout and put on our Patreon, because he's just going into, I mean, the irony of us talking about excessive detail in a podcast that is known for excessive detail. You know, my motto for Draft Zero was quantity has a quality of its very own. Is kind of what we feel. That you've got this great little thing about treatment structuring, right? Because what I want to get to is, I think for me that, and you may disagree with Stephen, but let's probably not get into the detail of it because it will just derail us for another half hour. Is the treatments for the writer in a prose form are a specific working document that can take a form that suits the writer, right? Whether it's a scriptment form that I write, or something that's more written prose form that Chas writes. But that is very different from a treatment that is a selling document broadly, as in selling for someone that's to someone that's not the writer. That's just because they're selling to yourself, but they're selling to other people. This I like. This idea is what do readers want when they read a story treatment. They want to be involved, excited, and thrilled. The biggest problem treatments have is that they often read like a list of things that happen one after another. Make sure in your treatment, action derives from character. What happens in your story does so because the people in the story, being who they are, do that. That's what people like them do. Make sure the reader feels that. If you do that, your story won't read too plotty. To use your example of the hair, because that feels like something that you would do in a treatment, that it's very easy to go, he wanders into the cafe and this happens, but relating it back to how people react will pull us into the story. Is there anything else that you can kind of go, when we read our treatment, how do we self-diagnose? Because that is, I think the problem is we can write these short documents. It's analyzing them and knowing what to look for. That is the hard part. I can sit there and go, I can go to the gym and do a bunch of weights, and I can sit there and go, but I have no idea whether my form is good or not. And, you know, surprising as it might be to Chas, I do weight training, and it's like, I have no idea whether my form is good, right? And without having to talk to someone else. So, but when I train fencing and sword, I've got enough knowledge now, but not, you know, like I'm still going to send video to my teachers, but I've got enough now to kind of self-analyze. What are the things that we should be looking at, particularly in treatments? Because I think we've talked a little about log lines. So the main selling documents that I see are log lines, synopsises, somewhere between 1 page and 4 pages, and then a fucking treatment before we get to the script. So the treatments to me are the most daunting. So I just want to kind of rate our focus on that.
The first thing is to think about whether or not the treatment, the length of the treatment, should be proportional to the way the story works. Which is to say, if you think of our 3 acts, the first act, second act, third act, broadly speaking, you know, the proportion is, in general terms, the middle act of a story. The middle of a story is about 70% of the story, roughly speaking. And if we're looking at a 15-page treatment, then you would break that down. If you were doing it chronologically, kind of accurately, without making an alteration, then your beginning will be 4 pages, your middle will be 8 pages, and your ending will be 3 pages. That would be proportionate to what a story normally is. But then you need to think about a story overall. Okay, what happens when you write a story? Well, when you write a story, or you need to tell a story, you start off with mainly action, because that's what pulls an audience into the story. This is what's happening. We come into the story and this is what's going on. And you don't start a story with, well, you can, but you don't often start a story with, before I tell you what happens, I need to tell you about who these people are. Okay, so there's this man, and he's a little bit grouchy, and he's got a sore leg, and he doesn't tell people how sore his leg is, but he aches all the time, so that makes him short-tempered. And because he's short-tempered, people don't really talk to him very much, and so he's slightly lonely. And because he's slightly lonely because of his sore leg and he's short-tempered, he doesn't get out very much. Because he doesn't get out very much, he only knows a few people, and because he only knows a few people, the people he knows are all quite similar. So he has the same kind of worldview. That's not how you would start telling a story. We'll start telling a story with an old man who goes out of his house and he sees a young woman and he threatens her. Okay, and what it turns out to be is those people become great friends. Okay, that's our story. But you will start off with the action, because that's the way you pull the audience into a story. That's naturally what you would do. So a story will tend to be quite active at the beginning. It'll have a reasonable amount of action and lots of things going on. Once we've got the audience into the story, once we've attracted them with the action of the story, we then start to unfold the characters. So we say, okay, well, now we need to know more about who this man is and who this young woman is, and what their relationships are and what's going on in the rest of their lives. And that's where your middle of the story will come. That's what tends to happen in the middle, as we start to unfold character more. So what then happens is the pace of the action will slow down. We won't have the rapid progress of action that we'll have at the beginning section, because now that we've pulled the audience into the story, what we then do is start to make them more interested in character. So things will happen, but the pace of action will slow in the middle, because the meaning and the significance of the action is becoming clearer to the audience. As they are getting to know these people, they begin to, oh, that's why they do that. That's why they do that. So we're no longer as interested in they do this, they do this, they do this. We're asking the question, who are these people that would do these kind of things?
I mean, this is the classic Western homestead sequence. It's in so many movies once you see it, where everyone sits around and has a meal or hiding under the bridge. And it's like, oh, and this is this moment that I reveal my character wound, right? Like, we laugh about it for a cliche, but it exists, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so when you get into the middle, we know the people better. And so we were more interested in showing who they are through what they do than simply showing events. So the pacing of the, as it were, unfolding of events, of the plot slows down, because the deepening of the characters allows the plotting to slow down in order that we can explore the character. If you had endless staccato plotting through the middle, then you wouldn't have enough space for character. Like an action movie that's endlessly exploding doesn't have very complex characters, because there's no space for those characters in the storytelling. But in most stories, the middle is where it slows down, and at the end, we have to have a big exciting ending. We want to leave the audience, moved and transported and wrecked. So what we do at the end is we take the speed of the plotting of the opening, and we have the significance of the meaning of the action that we've given through the character we've done in the middle, and those things combine. So the pace of the story picks up again at the end of the story. So if you think about the pacing of the plotting of the story, it's fast at the beginning. This is very general. It reminds me very much of the Monty Python definition of a dinosaur, which is thin at one end, fat in the middle, and thin at the other. This is kind of what a story is like. The action is fast at the beginning, slows down through the middle, and speeds up again at the end. So the problem for writing a treatment is that a treatment suits plotting. We know this. A treatment is a prose document because it's a compression, because that's all treatments are, a compression of the story. When you compress character, it's harder to write. A compressed character is harder to, the character is complex and multifarious, whereas an action in a story is relatively simple. This happens. So it's quite easy to write a compressed version of this happens. It's easier to write a compressed version of this happens than it is to write a compressed version of this is who this person is and how he's evolving through time, or she's evolving through time. That's a much harder thing to write in a compressed form. That's why we write scenes for characters, where we show the nature of the character in the scene. So to compress that into a sentence, the evolution of the character is much harder. So the treatment suits plotted action, and it doesn't suit character as much. So that section of your story where you have most character, which is the middle of the story, in the treatment is the part that you're going to have most difficulty with, irrespective of the story you're writing. Okay, it doesn't matter who the characters are or whatever. That's always going to be the case. So if you represent your treatment proportionately, as it would be, for example, in the screenplays, if you devote 70% of your treatment to the middle section of the story, you're devoting 70% of your treatment to the most difficult part to write in relation to character, in relation to the treatment, because it's got more character in it. So one trick, I would say, in relation to treatment writing is compress the middle, is don't write it proportionately. So when you get to write the treatment, be aware that the middle, where the most character work is going to be the most difficult part to write. So don't devote as much space to it. Okay, so just compress it down. You have to get the big character movements in, the things that the change in the character through the middle, but don't think that you have to represent the middle of the story proportionately to the beginning and the end. Okay, you should actually spend slightly more time proportionally on the ending and more time on the beginning and less time on the middle. So you compress. So rather than going, if our proportionate treatment will be 4 pages for the opening, 8 pages for the middle, 3 pages for the end, I would say change that to something like 5 pages for the beginning, 6 pages for the middle, and 4 pages for the end. And I'm not saying that the ideal is 15 pages. The same would be true proportionally if it was 9 pages. But just compress the middle.
Yeah.
Okay. Be aware that the middle of the story, which is the more character development in the story, is going to be harder to get through in the treatment for the reader. So don't spend so much time on it. Spend more time on unfolding the action at the beginning in order to pull the reader into the story. This is what's happening, and spend a little bit more time on detailing what's happening. And then when you get to the end, you're describing this is how that character resolves. And so you're spending more time on the ending. That way, compressing the middle when you write a treatment makes the treatment easier to read.
Yeah. I mean, not to reduce all of that amazing insight down to a soundbite, but I feel like if you're taking my 20-page very plotty document and just reducing it down to 4 pages, you will instinctively be focusing on theme, character, journey, all those things that are important to invite the reader to interact with the document more and find what it is that sells the document or the story, rather than focusing on how are we telling this story.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, bearing that in mind, those things, even when you're writing a 10-page treatment or a 12-page treatment, bear in mind that what you're trying to do is take the audience on the journey of the character. You're not trying to summarize the story. And that's what, again, you're not trying to say, well, I have to take the audience through the story beat by beat. I'm not taking my step outline, which is a 25-page document, a summary of each scene in the story and each important scene. I'm not taking that and reducing it to 12 pages or 10 pages. What I'm trying to do is take the audience on the journey that I want the film audience or the TV audience to go on with the character. And I want those emotions that I want them to feel as they watch it. I want those emotions replicated in the reader. That's what I'm doing, which is why you need to do those short documents that are shorter first, because those documents, the story synopsis and a quick, 4-page or 2-page or 1-page document is going to take the reader to the kind of essence of the story in a way that, the longer treatment does. It's why your premise, that motive that made you write the story in the first place, that feeling that you have, that you want to keep hold of and let the audience feel, it's important to know what that is as you're writing a treatment. You've done all your work on the breaking down of the story, like you said, your 20-page document. But once you've got that, you've done the work. Now you can then make it into an experience for the audience, for the reader. And that's really what the treatment's about, is taking the reader on an experience. It's not about, I have to lay out the entire story. And it's just bearing that in mind. You have to lay out some of the story, but you're not laying out everything. You're taking the audience on a ride.
I think that's a really good, in a way that's the key difference. Like, it's a long time to get there, but the key difference between like a selling document and the development document is the selling document is about taking the reader on an emotional journey, and that can be to the writer as well, reminding them what emotionally connects them to it, but also that your purpose isn't. Don't assume that just because you're sending this to people that work as distributors or as they will look at a technical document in the same way, that they're going to want to have an emotional journey, right? And that's kind of, that's kind of advertising, tap people in emotionally. So I think this is a good point now, because it feels like we've led somewhere, to kind of take audience questions before we wrap it up. So I'm going to, while people type some questions, I'm going to thank our patrons And so people can type their questions in the Facebook live chat or in our Zoom chat. Chas, do you want to? I'm trying to load. I'm having slow internet now. It's annoying. Trying to load the internet, the Patreon page.
Oh, look, I feel like we've covered a huge amount of ground in this. But give the people who've borne with us 20 seconds in which to venture some of their own questions. We asked the pertinent ones that came up as they came along.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess there's one observation from Simon Trevo back at the beginning was that Final Draft has the option to read the script to you, and there's certainly some dedicated script reading applications now that will use computer voices. And I think there's even one where you can submit the script and they'll cast actors for you and basically give you a paid script read that you don't direct, but at the same time, it's I think it's just a service, right? And it makes kind of makes sense. And we're now living in the age of Zoom. So, you know, actually, the Patreon page isn't loading for me, Chas.
That sounds great, actually. I mean, I've not used it on Final Draft.
There was this amazing app that cast computer voices, but I'm not sure if it survived beta testing, but they asked us to beta test it, where you would cast the voices yourself, and you could go and sort of put together a digital automated screen read,
a table read, which going back to that idea that it actually it has some value, because you're like, oh, why am I getting a computer to read it? And the answer is because that the lack of emotion becomes useful. You know, like it lets you analyze the words on the page and the way you've structured it.
All right. Given we haven't had many questions from the YouTube, I sound so fucking old.
From the internet.
Thank you very much to our patrons who made this and much more Draft Zero possible. Thanks to Chris Walker, Jack Smith, Jesse Laurie, Crob Edmonds, Matteo Bernardini, Nick MacArthur, Sandra Willis, and Theus Bergstrom.
My internet's really playing up, and given I'm the one broadcasting, that's slightly concerning.
Also, super thanks to you, Stephen, for all the prep that you've done, and for getting up earlier than you would like to spend hours on the internet talking to people around the world.
No problem. I'm just sorry that I've had to. I haven't had my haircut for 2 weeks. My family were telling me, they said, "Oh, you're going to go on the internet and you're going to do your hair. It's ridiculous. You look like a kind of 70s television personality." So I'd like to apologize in advance in retrospect for my peculiar hair to everyone who's watching online.
All right, Stephen, I'm taking off my hat.
Yeah, you too. It's funny. Ridiculous hair for a while.
All right. That feels as good a point to do it as any, especially given my kids are in the bath just downstairs and dying to sing and scream and make loud interfering noises.
Okay, well, good luck, and thanks everybody for tuning in.
Oh, Stu has frozen and apparently disappeared, which is slightly worrying, as he said, given he's broadcasting this, but hopefully YouTube listeners have heard. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining in. I am leaving the meeting now.
Great. Cheers.
Bye, Stephen.